You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Common Descent, a podcast about paleontology, evolution, Earth history, and the like. This is episode 211. This is our Darwin Day episode for the year.
Darwin Day!
Darwin Day is February 12th, and in February we have a little tradition where we talk about historical figures on and around Darwin Day. This episode, we will be discussing Edward Drinker Cope, one of the most famous names in early paleontology, especially here in North America, and often not for good reasons.
Yep, infamous even.
Infamous, notorious. This is a person who has come up before because episode 58, we did a whole discussion about the Bone Wars, and he was one of the two people whose fault that was.
So if this is your first time hearing us talk about him, there's some insight into what we're going to be dealing with.
This episode, we will discuss this person, his history, his work, his legacy, all that stuff. For our discussion about this fascinating and entertaining person, we will be joined by a fascinating and entertaining guest for much better reasons than the man we will be discussing. After the news, we will be joined by Astrid Lundberg to chat about Cope and all the things Copey. Very excited to have Astrid joining us on the podcast. We met Astrid at DragonCon this past year, and we're very excited to get her voice among ours on the podcast.
Because she's great.
This topic, as always, was requested by some of our listeners. In this case, a Cope episode was requested by Mark and Jonathan.
Nice.
Thank you both very much. Before we get into stuff, here's a bunch of announcements. First of all, as always, this podcast is supported top to bottom by our patrons on Patreon. Their generous support allows us to do all of the things we do with the podcast, and in return, they get goodies like bonus content and live streams with us, asking questions for us to answer on the podcast. There's cool merch stuff, and one of the rewards you can get as a patron is your name shouted out on the podcast when you join at certain levels. This episode, we would like to welcome new patrons Zelphia, David, and Sharon.
Welcome. Thank you for your support.
If you would like to support us on Patreon as well, you can find a link in the episode description to our Patreon. It's an exciting time here at the beginning of 2025. We got a lot of cool stuff going on. If you head over to the Common Descent YouTube channel, you can check out the first episode of our new series, Bricks with Basque.
Yeah!
Where Will builds paleontology-themed Lego sets.
It's so much fun.
Very fun, cool stuff. Also, our listener survey is currently out. You can find a link to our listener survey in the episode description. The questions on the listener survey allow us to get a sense of who's listening and make plans for future projects based on what we know about our audience. And also, the poll is back.
Yep.
So you, at the end of the survey, you get to vote on snakes versus crocs. Ooh, maybe we'll release the results for Croc and Snake Month.
Oh, yeah.
Ooh, that could be cool. Maybe. Yeah. I just thought of that. So, we'll see what we do. Also, next month, in the end of March, we will be returning to ETS Yukon.
Yes.
In Johnson City, Tennessee. We will be doing a few panels on Sunday, March 30th. A Dungeons & Dragons Speculative Evolution panel. A Jurassic World panel called Dinos Run Amok, where we will talk about what would happen if dinosaurs were released into the real world. And, just like last year, an Ask a Paleontologist Q&A panel with some of our paleontology friends from the Gray Fossil site. It's going to be super cool. If you're around, come check it out. This year, we're also doing an extra special thing. On Saturday, that same weekend, the 29th, we will be doing a meetup with fans at the Gray Fossil site and museum. We're going to be there in the afternoon at noon. Any of our fans are welcome to come, say hi with us, hang out, explore the exhibits, and hopefully we'll get to introduce you to some of the people who work there at the museum. This is the first time we've ever done a museum meetup. We also want to do one later in the year in Atlanta at DragonCon. If this is something, dear listener, that you would be interested in joining and participating, let us know. Reach out to us, let us know. We'll start a channel on the Discord so people who want to come to this particular meetup can make their voices heard in that channel so that we have some sense of how many people might actually be showing up for this.
Yeah, it should be a ton of fun.
It'll be great. We love meeting with our fans, and we'll get to walk around a museum together. It'll be super cool.
Yes.
Speaking of interacting with our fans, we have mail.
Yes, we do.
What did we get?
We got a Valentine's Day card from Elizabeth with a little dino holding a heart plush.
Yeah.
And it's just so cute. He's got little floppy feet, and I love them. It's great.
Absolutely adorable. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Happy Valentine's Day back to you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
And to all of our lovely listeners. If you want to send us mail, our mailing address is on our website. Link in the episode description. Also in the episode description, you will find a couple of links to organizations that we would like to shout out here at the top of the podcast, because times are tough out there in a lot of places for a lot of people. So this podcast episode, we want to give a shout out first to the California Fire Foundation, which provides support and financial assistance to firefighters, families, and communities. They also take donations. You can find a link in the episode description. And we want to give a shout out to the organization Trans Lifeline, which provides community support for trans people, resources for coming out, legal assistance, advocacy. It's a great resource for people in the trans community who are in need of support, and they also accept donations. We've donated to them in the past. That link will also be down in the episode description. There's a lot going on out in the world, and it's difficult to keep up with all of it and to engage with all of it. So knowing about resources, sharing resources, and if you're able, donating to resources like these can be very helpful.
Yeah, let's have each other's back out there.
And with that, we can move on to the news. Every episode, before we get into our main topic, we pick some news from the world of paleontology and such to keep us all up to date. Will, why don't you start?
Happily. My first news is about a surprisingly big small pterosaur.
A big small pterosaur?
Yeah. This is research by David Hone and Skye McDavid in Paleontology and Evolutionary Science, and the article is by Jake Bueller in Science News. So the pterosaur in question, the flying reptile in question, is Rhamphorhynchus, a very famous member of the pterosaur group. These were alive during the Jurassic and are found mostly in Europe and Africa. They were typically smallish pterosaurs, so they didn't have like head crest. They had a long tail, famous for their snaggly teeth that would interlock.
Yeah, these are small for pterosaurs, but big for birds.
Yeah.
Like if we think about birds today.
Yes, they're still decently sized. They said that the adult specimens we have usually have around a 1 meter wingspan. Mm-hmm. So like large crow sized.
Yeah.
Most of the ones we have are juveniles, so we don't have a ton of adults by comparison, but they are the best known pterosaur. We have over 100 specimens that have been known for centuries. So they are extremely well known in many regards. The specimen in question here, and that was being analyzed in this study, is one that was kind of a gap in understanding, or a question as to exactly how it fit into the rest of Rhamphorhynchus specimens. This is a nearly complete skeleton that was dug up in the mid-1800s, so it's been known for quite some time. It came from southern Germany, and is still partially preserved in 3D, so really nice specimen. The reason it's been kind of a mystery specimen, or a debated specimen, is because its wingspan is about 1.8 meters.
Ooh, that's about my wingspan.
Yep. This is almost double a lot, but for the largest specimens, 60% bigger. So, a unusually large Rhamphorhynchus specimen. And among the largest known non-pterodactyloid pterosaurs.
Yes, so one of the biggest small pterosaurs.
Yes. So this is unusually big for this kind of pterosaur. It also has some notable differences in its anatomy that make it stand out. So throughout its history, different interpretations have been applied to it. Initially, it was treated as a distinct species. In 1995 was the first time it was proposed that all Rhamphorhynchus specimens known belonged to a single species.
Okay.
Rhamphorhynchus munsteri, which kind of brought doubts back onto this one, because if all specimens are one species, is this the single specimen that's not that species, or is this a surprisingly unusual member of that species? So that's part of what this research was trying to do, is fully analyze the specimen and really get a look at it. They took more detailed measurements of the skull and body and compared it to other Rhamphorhynchus specimens and found lots of unique characteristics other than the 1.8 meter wingspan. It also has eye sockets that are proportionally smaller, and the other openings of the skull behind the eyes are bigger. But one of the most notable differences is that the teeth have a slightly different morphology. Smaller Rhamphorhynchus have interlocking teeth that are needle-like, round in cross-section, pretty standard tooth. Just sharp reptile tooth if you think about croc tooth. Kind of like that, but smaller and sharper. These are broader and flattened, which, along with the differences in the skull, have suggested to the researchers that it's likely eating something different, that its diet maybe has shifted. They note that the smaller Rhamphorhynchus, it's known that they ate things like shrimp and fish, but that, as they put it, those types of food would fall between the teeth of this bigger one. That these teeth would not be good at catching that kind of prey. They proposed maybe this is a shift to more terrestrial prey, lizards and small mammal type of stuff, which could also maybe suggest that they wouldn't have been as common near the ocean where many Rhamphorhynchus are known. So potential there. They also say that this would match up with like the kind of niche partitioning that we've talked about with animals, where they go through different lifestyles as they age. So if this is indeed a bigger member of the species, then it could be something like that, which it seems, due to their research, that does seem to be what this is.
Interesting.
That this is just the upper size that we hadn't seen yet of this group, and that these are the changes that happen in Rhamphorhynchus as they grow. They say that the features that it shows, the unique ones compared to the other members, do fit in similar growth patterns seen in other animals. So
with like the smaller eyes
Yeah.
is something we see in adult animals a lot of the time.
So the proportions here are not unusual.
Right. Like if you took Rhamphorhynchus that we already have of every age, this one fits on the end of that spectrum.
Yeah.
That continuum.
It does fit in the logical progression that we might expect for their growth.
Okay.
And ontogeny. That being said, the article also interviewed Dave Unwin, who is a paleontologist of the University of Leicester in England, who seems to be all right with it being an older individual, but disagrees with the shift in diet.
Okay.
Says it's, at least mainly, that the anatomy is, in their words, wholly unsuited for foraging in terrestrial habitats. So they disagree on that. So exactly what these shifts might still be a bit more up to debate as what they mean for the animal.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't shifting from aquatic prey to land prey, maybe a different variety of aquatic prey or slightly bigger aquatic prey.
They said that the skeletal differences are better explained as a consequence of having a heavier build that just comes with being a bigger animal.
Okay,
That
makes sense.
They might not be a behavioral shift, but just you're bigger now, so you're different.
Yeah.
But it does seem that this is just a big Rhamphorhynchus, same species as the others likely, and just the upper reaches of this group that we hadn't gotten a glimpse, or we haven't gotten many glimpses of, except for this very well-preserved specimen.
Very cool. This is something we've mentioned before that is particularly true with dinosaurs and other ancient reptiles, that most of our fossils are not full-grown specimens.
Yes.
And that, in the case, and it varies from species to species, but a lot of Mesozoic reptiles were reaching sexual maturity or becoming fully independent and successful individuals before they actually got to full size.
Yes.
And were also often dying before they got to full size, which is also true of animals today. So we have this skewed perception in the fossil record where a lot of the species that we have aren't full grown.
Yeah.
And so it's very fun to get one that's, this is what we were missing. We were missing the elder Rhamphorhynchus.
Yes. And it's because like most animals don't shift a ton always at their upper size. Like the biggest cow doesn't look that much different than a smaller cow.
Right.
But some animals do look like the biggest, oldest crocs look notably more gnarly, and their head is huge.
Yep.
So like the proportions are really notable in an unusually large member of certain species. So sometimes we can get surprises.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, I happen to also have a news about a specific fossil of a Jurassic reptile from Germany. This one is not a pterosaur. It is a plesiosaur.
Ooh.
Aquatic reptiles that preserves soft tissues that tell us some cool things about the outside of plesiosaurs.
Nice.
This is research in Current Biology by Miguel Marks et al., and we will link in the blog post to an article on Popular Science by Andrew Paul. Plesiosaurs are one of the big famous groups of marine reptiles from the Mesozoic. This is the group whose most famous members have the long necks with little heads at the end, and they've got 4 big flippers and short tails, kind of like a sea turtle. There are lots of skeletons of plesiosaurs. We have lots of well-preserved fossil skeletal remains, but not much in the way of soft tissues preserved alongside those fossils. According to this paper, there have only been, prior to this, 8 known specimens, documented specimens of plesiosaurs with any soft tissue remains. This paper describes a new one, so presumably a 9th one.
Cool.
This is a very well-preserved, essentially complete skeleton of a plesiosaur. I didn't see a genus or species, so I don't know if it's been identified to what genus or species it is. But it is about 3.5 meters long, so about 11 to 12 feet, which is a fairly moderate size for a plesiosaur.
Yep.
Comes from the late Jurassic of Germany, around 183 million years old. Discovered way back in 1940, but recent preparation on the specimen has allowed them to not only uncover the bones, but specific areas where the sediment next to the bones has preserved some remnants of soft tissues.
Cool.
Soft tissues are preserved on the tail and the right front flipper. It sounds like the back side, like the trailing edge of the right front flipper.
Cool.
They examined these preserved soft tissues with a variety of techniques. They listed a whole bunch of them: X-ray and scanning electron microscope and infrared scanning, making this the first in-depth study of plesiosaur soft tissues.
Oh, that's exciting.
On the tail, the soft tissue retains pigments and other cellular structures, so not uncommon in preserved skin remains, and no scales.
Okay. Yep.
Which is unusual for reptiles broadly, but not unusual for marine reptiles.
Yes.
We also see scales lost or reduced in ichthyosaurs as well as in metriorhynchids, the marine crocs. The loss of scales is thought to be, at least in part, to reduce drag.
Yeah.
It smooths out the body shape, kind of like if you think about a dolphin or a seal. They've got a much smoother body profile.
Yeah, because you can be furry or scaly and still be good in water, like
an otter.
Otters and crocodiles today, but most of them aren't doing long distance, miles and miles and miles.
Yes, they're not fully marine.
Yeah. And when you're traveling across oceans, potentially, every bit of drag counts.
Yes. So this seems to suggest that plesiosaurs, like other marine reptiles, reduced their scales. However, the flipper has scales.
Oh, that's why I saw art of that.
So, yes, now there's art. So the flipper, like I said, there's soft tissue along the trailing edge, so not the leading edge, of the right front flipper, and they described it as featuring tiny sub-triangular scales.
Okay.
So kind of triangle-shaped. They noted that overall the tissue structure on because they're getting microscopic details of the tissue and the internal structure of it, how it's layered, is all fairly similar to modern reptiles like sea turtles, which is not at all surprising. But this seems to suggest that at least this species of plesiosaur lost scales in some places and kept them in others. And the researchers posit some hypotheses as to why it might have kept scales on the flipper. One suggestion is that it might be to help stiffen the flipper for swimming. This actually is very similar to the news we talked about, I think, last episode about the pterosaur tails.
Yes.
And about how stiffening the tail helps it to be more aerodynamic. Stiffening the flipper might have helped it to be more hydrodynamic, more rigid in its structure, which helps it do its job. Apparently, this scales on the flipper has also been noted in other plesiosaur specimens.
Okay.
So this might have been a consistent feature. They also suggested that scales on the flippers might have been a protective feature if the plesiosaurs were hanging out on the bottom of the ocean floor.
Yes.
That these scales might have been either to protect the flippers as they made contact with the sea floor, or to provide traction.
Yep.
Help them grip if they're moving around on the sea floor. Apparently, there is some previous evidence from gut contents and even trace fossils of plesiosaur bottom feeding.
Yep.
There are some plesiosaurs whose gut contents have sediment in there, along with little critters, which is also seen in things like manatees and dolphins that feed on the bottom of the ocean. So plesiosaurs are an interesting case where it seems like they did not completely lose their scales. They might have kept them around in some places for certain functions.
Which is really cool. Because, there are scaly sea animals, like sea turtles.
Sea turtles are very scaly.
Yep. So, not unreasonable, even though it makes sense to get rid of your scales if you want to be as streamlined as possible, you still can make it work.
Yeah.
Having it patchworked to a degree is very intriguing.
Yeah.
The other idea I had about why it might be good to have armored flippers is if you're using them in a combat kind of capacity.
Like if they're smacking each other,
Yeah.
or if that's where plesiosaurs are biting each other.
Yes, or if that's how they thinned off, predators. Because that whales will do that. They humpback whales have those crazy long flippers, and they'll smack things with them. So maybe I need this armored because it's out in the world, so it's in danger, and I'm gonna hit my rival with it, smack him upside the head.
Well, and sea turtles today, and now, like you said, sea turtles are also very scaly. Sea turtles are also very weird.
Yes,
turtles are very comparing anything to turtles is always a bit of a dubious prospect.
Yep.
But sea turtles also use their flippers for movement, but also for tough, they're digging nests, they're crawling up onto the beach, which puts a lot of stress on the flippers that those scales might help to protect from.
Yeah, absolutely. So it would make a lot of sense.
Cool. Yeah, and I don't, the idea of a plesiosaur hanging out on the very bottom of the ocean, just sort of walking itself along the sea floor with its little flippers, swooping its head back and forth to look for food. That's a very cool image of a plesiosaur.
I like that a lot. It's also one of those, anytime we get soft tissue, we usually get really cool insights.
Yes.
Sometimes, though, it's just they're shaped the way we thought.
Yeah, you're doing the thing we expected you to do.
This is one of those, this is like the Psittacosaurus kind of stuff where it's no, you need to draw them different now.
Yeah.
The texture on their flippers needs to be different than at least the tail.
Yes.
Probably other parts of the body. So now they need to have different texture, and that's cool.
Yes. That knowledge of specific little details is just so fun for imagining them as full living animals.
Yeah, it's so satisfying.
Plesiosaurs episode 72, and for that matter, pterosaurs episode 79.
Yeah, absolutely. There's other cool soft tissue stuff with the plesiosaurs we talked about there, because that's how they investigated the tail fin, if they had it or not.
Because there is a tail fin in some specimens as well.
Yep. My next news, I want to talk more about flying animals with weird teeth.
All right. Birds.
This is a research about bat teeth.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense.
Yes. And they're using this as a model to look at the evolution of mammal teeth and how they develop. This is research by Alexa Sadier et al. In Nature Communications, and the article is by James Urton in SciTech Daily. So mammal teeth we talk about all the time are kind of our big deal thing.
It's the thing that we do best,
Yes.
Except for hadrosaurs,
Yes.
which have also, But it's like the mammal claim to fame is teeth and milk.
It's what we always bring to the talent show.
Yes. Year after year, it's teeth again. All right. You come up with some new kind of tooth?
It's still impressive, though. It's still impressive.
It's still pretty cool. This time I made a tooth that's just the left canine, and it sticks straight out of my face. Incisor? Incisor.
Yes.
It's an
Yeah, I
incisor.
think it's
the left
incisor.
incisor sticks straight out of my face, and it spirals like a unicorn.
Because it's ridiculous. One aspect of mammal teeth that doesn't always get talked about is that we have tooth classes. We have types of teeth. We have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars, which are distinct types of teeth. So, like, they're not just different shapes of teeth. They are unique categories and are grown and developed slightly differently. That is also a big deal feature of mammals and is considered one of the reasons we became so successful on this planet. But understanding exactly how tooth classes developed and diversified and change across mammalia is not as well understood. So this research was wanting to look into that using a particular group, which is noctilionid bats, which is an incredibly diverse group of bats. It includes over 200 species found mostly here in the Americas. And even though they are fairly closely related, their diets range an insane amount. They've been compared to the bat version of Darwin's finches, where they have diversified into many different feeding styles, and their morphology in their jaws and teeth have changed in suit with that. They've evolved insect eaters, fruit eaters, nectar eaters, fish eaters, and blood eaters, because they include the vampire bat. Yep.
Nice.
So some of the most different foods you can think of.
Yes.
And their jaws match. There's short bulldog-like ones for getting into tough fruit and long-snouted ones for nectar. We talked about the crazy anatomy of the vampire bat.
Yeah, episode 134.
Yes. This is a great showcasing of how the tooth formula changes and can change. It all happened in a fairly short amount of time, about 25 million years. So that's a pretty quick evolutionary period. So they took a look at many of the species and compared them between each other to see how are they changing and what patterns do we see in the change of their teeth.
Yeah, not just how the teeth generally are changing shape to fit various functions, but specifically the different tooth classes.
Yes.
Interesting.
To see, is there a pattern in how we as mammals, at least in these bats, adjust our teeth depending on the different features that these bats are experiencing. They combined morphological, developmental, and mathematical modeling to try to get a cohesive look at what's happening with these teeth. And one of the major things they found was that the diversification of tooth number and size seems to be driven by jaw growth rate, and that there was a consistency to the changes in that the number of teeth, the number, size, and shape of teeth, as well as their position, synced up with the size of the jaw most closely.
Okay.
Shorter jaws had less teeth because there was less room, and longer jaws had more teeth.
Interesting. That is very interesting because that is also a trend, very specifically, that we have seen in human evolution.
Yes.
Our specific lineage has reduced the space for teeth in our mouths. That seems to be one of the main reasons why our wisdom teeth are so weird these days.
Absolutely. They found that there are certain developmental rules, quote unquote, that cause them to effectively generate the right number of teeth for the size of jaw they have.
Yeah.
That there is a pattern to the way the teeth develop, and it's so that you have a fitting number of teeth for however big your mouth has become.
Right. Well, that's the problem with wisdom teeth, is when they don't fit in the jaw properly, they end up coming in wrong and they can cause damage to the bone and the other teeth.
Absolutely. They noted that the longer jawed bats, or intermediate ones, so the nectar feeders and like insect eaters, for examples of those two, respectively, had the usual complement of mammal teeth. The incisors, and canines and so forth. 3 premolars, 3 molars on each side. The more classic, what we often think of as the default mammal tooth arrangement.
Much closer to the ancestral condition.
Precisely. Bats with shorter jaws tend to have fewer, so these are typically like the fruit eaters. They would usually ditch the middle premolar or back molar, if not both.
Okay, interesting. Back molar. That's the one that we're ditching.
Yep. And I found it's the middle premolar. That it was seemed to be fairly consistently that premolar.
Interesting.
Yeah. They also noted that they tended to have wider front molars, which seemed to have be filling the space. That losing that premolar left a little bit more space than fully was accounted for by the shortening of the jaw.
Right. So now this molar is doing the job of 1.5 teeth.
Yeah. So it would widen out. So they found some really interesting patterns to the tooth development. There was more detail of like the tooth nubs and how they develop, and there was a cascading pattern to the way development seems to change. But this is a really way to get insight into how do mammal teeth work.
Yeah. What are the rules of changing mammal tooth counts?
Yes.
That's fascinating, and now I want them to do the same thing across carnivorans.
Yes.
Because this is always one of my favorite things to point out about dogs and cats, that dogs have retained the ancestral placental mammal tooth count, and cats have lost most of their molars and premolars.
Yep.
Which seems to be related to their diet, because cats have lost all of their crushing teeth and have kept basically only the sharp ones.
Mm-hmm.
But they also have much shorter faces.
Yeah.
So that makes me wonder, would we see these same patterns if we looked across dogs, cats, bears, hyenas? Do they show the same pattern?
Yeah.
And then I would want to look at herbivores.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they are doing a lot of weird things with their, like horses and deer are doing very strange things.
Yes.
It would be so cool if this kind of research led us to because we have this kind of rule with like digit loss.
Yeah.
Like when an animal lineage reduces its toes and fingers, there is a certain pattern to which digits tend to be reduced first and which ones tend to remain. It would be super cool to know that about teeth across different mammal groups.
Well, and it's cool to have the perspective that it may be not as directly attached to diet as you think, as your jaw's responding to diet.
Yes.
Because a shorter jaw has a stronger bite, regardless of what teeth are in it. And a longer jaw can do different jobs than a short jaw. And that then has a heavy effect on how many teeth you're going to have to work with.
Very cool.
It's cool.
That's cool stuff. Well, my last bit of news is also sort of related to teeth, but mostly it's about chemistry. This is research, but also mainly an expanding data set for strontium isotopes and their usefulness in linking animals and things and people to specific locations.
Cool.
This is research by Shuiya Wang et al. In Nature Communications, and we will link to an article in Science News by Catherine Cornet. We've talked a bunch in past episodes of the podcast about stable isotope analysis. Isotopes are different forms of the same elements within our bodies: calcium, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on. And the ratio of one form of that element to the other form of that element is often related to things like diet or how the animal was living. Strontium isotopes specifically are linked to the location that an animal developed in.
Yes.
So by measuring the ratio of strontium isotopes, you can link, for example, this came up a bunch in episode 187 about migration, because you can look at the strontium ratios in a mammoth or in a dinosaur and say this is linked to this region of this area. So this animal grew up over there and then moved over here. You can connect geographic locations, which is very cool. But importantly, in order to do this, you need to know the strontium composition of the regions you're looking at.
Yes.
If you just have the tooth of a mammoth or the tusk of a mammoth, by itself the strontium doesn't tell you anything. You need to compare it with the geology of different parts of that region.
Yeah, you can say it has a strontium level of this.
Yes.
So wherever that is, that's where they came from.
Yes. So you have to sample the geology. Specifically, these studies are comparing the ratio of strontium-87 to strontium-86, the difference between those. Google it. That's atomic chemistry. The ratio is related to local geology built into the rocks, and then it is taken up into animals by plants and water, and then we build our bodies out of that, and we inherit that strontium relationship. This is useful in paleontology, like I said, for things like tracking migrations. In archaeology, this can help track the migration of human movements or trade routes. There's been research that has used strontium to be like, this ivory that was traded came from this other place. So like a trade route, your strontium can help you with. In modern wildlife, it's used to track animal migrations, but also like black market trade of goods. And it's also useful in forensics. For if you have human remains, you can figure out, if you need to, where this person was from. So, very broadly useful. This research project took measurements of strontium ratios from areas of Africa that have not been sampled very much.
I was wondering.
Yeah, they point out in this paper that there's, especially in West and West Central Africa, there's a lot of geographic areas that we just don't have the strontium data. So here they take measurements of strontium ratios from 778 samples, including plants, soil samples, also animals, like it sounds like invertebrates and stuff, from across 24 countries on the continent of Africa, and then combining that with previous data. I think they said something like 1,400 previous samples. They were able to generate a strontium isoscape for sub-Saharan Africa. So basically, here is what the strontium levels are for this just whole swath of this continent. This is very exciting and useful because they have put together now a reference data set that can be used for all these other kinds of studies. And in this paper, they demonstrate a utility of this data, not for any of the reasons that I listed before, but specifically to test it out, tracing the roots of enslaved people who were taken out of Africa.
Oh, wow.
So, as you may be familiar, dear listener, the transatlantic slave trade between the 15th and 19th centuries forcibly abducted and took at least 12.5 million African people out of their home country and continent to be taken largely to Europe and the Americas. It is a migration event, but it is a forced migration event.
Yes.
In fact, as they mentioned in the paper, the largest forced migration event in human history. There is lots of documentation from this time about the ships and where the ships were going and the numbers of, cargo with living human beings.
Yep.
But there is not very much documentation about where individual people came from.
Yes.
Because that is not what the people who were documenting things were interested in when they were doing it. So that means that people ended up being enslaved and carted off to all across Europe and the Americas, and we don't know where they came from.
Yep.
This is an ongoing, this legacy, for example, here in the United States, is extremely strong in the fact that there are lots of people who live in the United States now who don't know where their families are from.
Yeah. Or
like ancestrally. Yeah, like I know what countries my great-grandparents came from. A lot of people in the States, especially African-American people, don't know that because it wasn't documented.
Yes.
So here in this study, the researchers examined remains of enslaved African people from 2 cemeteries, both from the late 1700s, early 1800s, one in Brazil and one in South Carolina, and specifically measured those strontium isotope ratios to compare with their data. They noted that this kind of research is done with ancient DNA from those remains, and while ancient DNA can tell you who a person is related to, ancient DNA does not always tell you what specific geographic location that person came from.
Yes.
Here, they found that the strontium isotopes in these cemetery-buried individuals were found to match specific areas on the isoscape that they were able to generate. For example, there were a bunch of examples, but for example, 2 of the people from South Carolina, DNA suggested somewhere in West Africa, and the strontium isotopes narrowed it down yet further to specific parts of Ghana, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. 2 others were linked specifically to Angola. So this was basically a proof of concept. Here is a way that we can use this new strontium data set. And they point out that using these strontium isotopes, especially in conjunction with other tools like genetics or historic documentation, can not only help determine the origins of specific individuals, but also patterns of movement during this time of mass human trafficking. What were the patterns in where people were coming from and where they were ending up being taken to? So this study is real, like, it's a very exciting set of results because they have put together a data set that is useful in a huge number of different applications, and then they tested it out in a very profound and influential example.
Yeah, like this could potentially start to fill in a lot of the blanks from that time period.
Yeah, they didn't mention this specifically in the paper, so it may be that it's more complicated than it feels in my head, but I imagine that this could be useful for if you are a person living in the Americas or in Europe today who is descended from enslaved people who were taken from Africa. If your genetic lineage can be connected to buried individuals from a couple centuries ago, and then this kind of data can link those individuals to where they came from, that might be, you know, a few steps further than this research is prepared to go. But I feel like there's a lot of potential here in this kind of methodology, allowing us to connect not only dead people, but living people who are still around today to their country of origin, to their ancestral homelands.
Yes, absolutely.
Also, it's going to be super cool for, like, fossil animal migrations and archaeological and trade routes and all sorts of other stuff.
And that's always the fun with surveys like this that go through is, hey, we're just going to fill in all the
Here's a bunch of data that we didn't have.
Bunch of data, and, you know, they weren't doing that to do, you know, it's
right. They weren't doing this so that we could figure out elephant migration specifically.
We did this, and we did a proof of concept, and now there you go. And that it feels like so often these kind of surveys don't get the celebration that they often deserve. So it's always exciting when we get to hear about one and they get attention, because it's like, this kind of surveying is what allows other really the other research that gets news articles to happen. So it deserves our respect and our celebration. And so very cool.
They also mention in the paper what parts of Africa still aren't very well surveyed. And they this paper is specifically looking at Africa, but I imagine that this same thing is probably true of especially places like Southeastern Asia. Maybe Australia, Indonesia, like a lot of the, especially like equatorial and southern hemisphere regions could probably do with a similar survey treatment like this. So very cool. It's a very exciting study.
Yeah. Awesome.
And that's the news, which means we can move on. Speaking of irresponsible things from the 1800s, we can move on to our main episode discussion about notorious 1800s American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope. After this brief musical interlude, there will be a third voice joining the podcast, that of our guest Astrid Lundberg, who's going to take us on a journey through the life of E.D. Cope. Stay tuned. Hello, Astrid.
Hello, David. Hello, Will. Thank you for having me.
Yay, it's so good to have you on.
Thank you so much for joining us. We are thrilled. We can think of no one we would rather talk about our subject of this episode with than you.
Awesome. I do love to air historical scientists' dirty laundry. It's famously one of my favorite things.
Perfect.
In fact, before we get into this famous scientist, if you would please introduce yourself for any of our audience who don't know you yet.
Hi, my name is Astrid Lundberg. I run a TikTok page called Odd Pride and an Instagram page called Astrid_Lundberg, which is, I think, the current name of my YouTube channel as well. And if it's not, then you will probably find the right one by Googling me.
Let Astrid know.
Yeah, I've likely forgotten my name on one platform or other. I did write a joke bio for DragonCon, which is where the three of us met. So I'm going to read a sentence from that, which is Astrid Lundberg, also known as Odd Pride, is a self-employed science clown answering a question nobody has been brave enough to ask. What if young Sheldon was a butch chick with dinosaur autism? And I think that just about covers it.
It's pretty great.
I think it does.
I'm one of them social media talking heads, and the thing that I'm a talking head about is paleontology, evolutionary biology, and often also the history of those fields. So I'm really excited to talk about possibly the messiest man in the first century of paleontology, which is stiff competition.
It sure is. In fact, I did want to give you a chance before we actually start talking about this person. We discussed a handful of different options for which historical figure in paleontology your episode might be about, and you chose Cope. You were very excited to do an episode about Cope. What is it about Cope that made you want to do a discussion about him over all of the other choices?
Yeah, so I was thrilled that Cope was an option, that this topic wasn't preoccupied, unlike a number of the names that he used for animals that he discovered. So Cope was an outlandishly messy guy. He was a very colorful, larger-than-life personality, and also such a unapologetically bad person that I don't feel even a little bit guilty about roasting him on a podcast.
Absolutely. He deserves it still to this day.
Yes.
Yeah. He's best known for his participation, unless you're really nerdy about fish, he's probably best known for his participation in a chapter of early American paleontology called The Bone Wars.
Yeah.
Yes, that was episode 58 of this podcast.
And, you get bits and pieces of this story over the course of being a dinosaur enthusiast and getting, as you pick up your bits of paleontology lore and dinosaur lore and science history lore. And the colorful and eccentric personality of Edward Cope starts to emerge kind of like the way that you can infer the existence of an exoplanet by the way the star wobbles. You look at the late 19th century in American dinosaur paleontology and you're like, something happened here and somebody was really quirky about it.
Yes, he's like a black hole. You can detect his presence by how it affects the things around it.
Yes.
Well, let's begin to meet Edward Cope, who of course has been mentioned on this podcast many times, but we're going to focus in on him. Let's start with his origin story. What was Cope's early life like? Where did he come from?
So, Edward Drinker Cope, which I think is a name that gets funnier with each subsequent name in it, which is nice.
Yes.
Was born on July 28, I believe, in 1840 in Pennsylvania, to a family of his father was a gentleman farmer. So he was a farmer, but not in a very, socially humble or impoverished sense. This was a very bourgeois, very privileged family. Part of his father's family, I don't remember if his father himself was involved in this, had made a lot of money doing, shipping and imports in the early United States. And he had two younger sisters. He was a colorful and interesting child. It seems like that comes through really clearly. A precocious child. I think part of I've worked at an elementary school, and I think like children this precocious aren't quite as unusual as Cope's biographers and friends like to imply. Like you do meet 6-year-olds who are writing fluently and having opinions on fossil animals.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
But he was one of them from a very early age. His mother died when he was 3, which doesn't seem to have been the source of any particular trauma, although he did grow up to be weird, so shrug.
Yeah.
He later claimed that he didn't remember his mother, and his relationship to his stepmother was like sufficiently stable and it's sufficiently a non-event that he didn't seem to have processed that as a life-changing or life-altering trauma. There are some really endearing pieces of writing that come down to us from the young Edward Cope. When he was, I think, 11 or 12, he went off to boarding school, and there's this letter, actually 2 letters from him to his father, trying to justify the cost of ice cream.
Oh boy, we've all been there.
Yeah, really. I think the exact quote is like 3 cents worth at a time is enough for me or any boy. And then he like goes on to list like even more reasons why, he should have goodies because the other boys have goodies and the goodies are great and they're not that expensive really. His family were Quakers, which I bring up partly because it affects the way that he addresses people. So this was the 19th century. Thee and thou were no longer part of like common English, but Quakers still used thee and thou to address people they knew and liked.
Oh.
And the young Cope was no different. So he calls his father thee. He also, when he and Marsh were friends, he calls Marsh thee and thou. And then he stops theeing and thouing him quite dramatically at some point.
That would be the dramatic moment in the movie.
Absolutely, yeah. He stops. I'm not calling him thee anymore.
Yeah, he starts not beating the pretentious allegations, but I happen to know that in French, calling someone by the formal in like a socially inappropriate and jarring context has a word. There's a verb for that. He starts vouvoying Marsh. And it's loaded. So age 6, he went to see the Natural History Museum in Philadelphia, and it made an impression. He wrote to his aunt, I have been at the museum, and I saw Mammoth and Hydrarchus. Does thee know what that is? It is a great skeleton of a serpent. Aunt Susan bought me some pictures. One was a boa constrictor and one a shark, and I drew 2 sharks.
That's adorable.
Which is very cute.
This is an extremely relatable child.
Yes.
I have known this kid.
Yep.
100%. I kind of was this kid.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was about to say,
Yeah.
I've been this kid.
Yeah. Oh, also, so the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, which was where he describes visiting in that other letter. Apparently, he had a habit of visiting them as a child, and he almost always showed up with, like, animals that he had caught, like toads and snakes and salamanders. Like, so this little boy shows up at the museum, goes and finds the scientists, and is like, what's this?
Yes.
What kind of snake have I caught?
Yes.
It's very funny because Cope, so often when you hear about Cope, it's criticism and it's ridicule.
Yeah.
And there will be plenty of that in this episode because
Oh, yeah.
he is a ridiculous person and as Astrid, as you said, kind of a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But his origins sound in many ways very familiar to like, yeah, this is how dinosaur kids get
But
started.
It's like a paleontologist is evidently a paleontologist.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's so nice to see, like, to sort of peer through the decades and see an 1840s dinosaur kid
Yeah.
and recognize myself as a 1990s dinosaur kid.
Absolutely.
Real recognize real.
Yes. Yes.
It's also interesting to note a thing that Cope already in this description has in common with so many of the people who get their own episodes of our podcast focused on them, which is that he came from a wealthy family.
Yep, I had the same thought.
That this is how you became a paleontologist for the most part in the 1800s, is you started out with advantages. if you didn't, then like Mary Anning, you might have been influential, but nobody would know about it for 100 years because nobody was paying attention to you.
You needed to be rich back then if you were going to spend your time staring at rocks and bones.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like pretty strongly about the fact that the like academic marginalization of Mary Anning was as much a class thing as a gender thing.
Yeah.
Which is not the subject of the episode, but just you've reminded me I have an axe to grind about that.
Yes. Episode 80 for our listeners, Mary Anning, we hung out with Brittany Stoneberg and talked all about that.
Yes.
Yes. So, Cope, little baby Cope. Right, and it's because he grew up to be not just interpersonally problematic, which is, taken on its own, would be, like, kind of just funny at this point, at a distance of a century and a half. But, like, he went on to, spoiler alert for the rest of this episode, he went on to contribute to, like, scientific racism and scientific misogyny in a way that had, like, serious consequences for, like, the fate of the world. And it's so frustrating and so tragic to see him start out as this, smart, charming, endearing little boy who is like catching frogs in the woods and bringing them to the museum to get them identified.
Yeah. This is his supervillain origin story.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when you see the Kingpin and he's just like a kid down on his luck and you're like, oh, you could have turned out good.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned working in elementary school, and you have that moment when you work with kids, and kids are just kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and all of them are just kids.
You're just kids. When you grow up, which way this goes, there's no knowing, but you're just a kid right now, and you're just being who you are.
Yeah. Well, let's start moving into that science direction. How does Cope go from being this frog-catching 6-year-old to getting involved in science?
So, I just remembered, I forgot an anecdote that I jotted down.
Oh, please do.
So there's this biography of Cope, which I think is a little credulous, frankly. I think it is interesting that this woman got to know Cope well enough to write a book about him and came out of that process trusting him as much as she seems to. But so there's a letter from Cope aged about 12 to his younger sister, who was then about 11, saying, I've been having a great time on the farm on the summer holidays, and I've been hanging out with all these grown men and big boys who are shooting animals in the woods, and I'm not scared of guns at all anymore. And this biographer comments on that so Cope is kind of famously on record having confessed to his wife and a few of his peers that he was really uncomfortable around guns. He didn't want to hold them. He didn't even want to look at them. This biographer comments on that, saying, he was probably lying to his wife to make her more comfortable and make himself seem less violent. I think maybe 12-year-old Cope was lying to impress his sister. I think he was just scared of guns.
Absolutely. That's such an odd thing to specify, and it's the same way a kid would go, also, I didn't touch any of the things you told me not to touch. Like, I'm not afraid anymore.
By the way, I'm totally not scared of guns.
Yes.
Yes.
Right, so he went to this boarding school, which I forget the name of, from the age of 12 through what would have been like about high school education today. And around the age of 15, he seems to get really interested in natural science. And when he was 15, he again wrote to his father for money, specifically so that he could buy a bunch of textbooks. And he names the textbooks. And it's a geology textbook, an anatomy textbook, and something else. There's a third one that's also sort of paleontology adjacent. So he's clearly, around the age of 15, he's starting to get ambitious about this. This has always been fun, but now how do I cram as much knowledge on the subject into my head as I can?
Yes.
And I guess it's important to put ourselves in sort of framework. This is the mid 1800s. So paleontology is a very new thing in the world, right? Richard Owen just recently came up with the word dinosaur. Darwin has not yet published The Origin of Species. Like, this is the early development of paleontology, evolutionary science as we think of it today.
Yeah. So Origin of Species wasn't out yet, but by this point, Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle account was kind of a bestseller and a cultural touchstone of sorts. And in fact, young Cope read this book because his father gave it to the boarding school library, and it made kind of an impression of him. He talked about it quite a bit as a teenager. And I wonder, clearly a lot of things were happening. A lot of things happen in the minds of 15-year-olds. I used to be 15 and then I got better.
Yes. Yep.
So who knows what the final thing was that tripped the switch, but it does kind of seem to be maybe causal. Like, he read this story of this, young man going on an incredible adventure and seeing all of these fantastic animals and getting to put new names on them, which would go on to be very, very important to Cope, more so than it seems to be even to other biologists.
Yeah, and more so than was advisable.
Yes.
Yeah. This is the reason why half of the North American fossil animals have like 6 junior synonyms, after all.
We will address that later.
Yes. I feel like Cope's early life is just all foreshadowing. I love when a real person has ominous foreshadowing.
Yeah, where it's like, man, whoever wrote your life, they were doing a great job.
Absolutely. These are Chekhov's personality issues.
They really are. Also, over the course of his sort of childhood and adolescence, we start to see the seeds of what my armchair psychology pet theory holds was a decent chunk of what was wrong with Cope. He was very invested emotionally in impressing his father.
Yeah.
Like, in some ways, he and his father were unusually close for a parent and child in sort of a bourgeois family in the mid-19th century, but in other ways it seems like his father was perhaps unnecessarily disapproving and especially harsh, and instead of reacting to that with, well, screw you, it's not a phase, I'm my own person, Cope kind of doubles down, and he's like, no, my dad's approval is really, really important to me, and I am going to argue about the importance of me choosing my career and my interests and the price of ice cream until I'm blue in the face, because it's not enough to get away with it. He needs to believe in me and approve of me, not just sign off on it.
Yeah.
And I do think that actually has something to do with how weird Cope was about, like, his potential mentor figures and older friends throughout the rest of his life.
Yeah, he has a lot of famously friction-wrought relationships with men in positions of authority.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's kind of fragile about it. Like, he wants their approval, and then when he loses it or thinks he's lost it, he freaks out.
Interesting.
Yeah, isn't it interesting?
Yeah, it really is. That does put a lot into perspective.
So, when he was 18... or it said in the book that I found, it said by 1858. So when he was 17 or 18, he started volunteering at the Academy of Natural Sciences. This was also the end of his formal education. So he, speaking of things that Cope was insecure about, he didn't get a university degree, and he seems to have felt a little weird about it for the entire rest of his life.
Yeah, chip on his shoulder.
He had the resources to. I don't know why he didn't. We'll never know why he didn't. But yeah, he didn't, and he felt weird about it.
Yeah.
And in his defense, to this day, there are still people in academic circles who will judge others based on how far they got in their schooling, which is an unfortunate truth about modern academia. And I can only imagine that it wasn't better in the mid-19th century.
Yep.
So, aged 17 or 18, he starts cataloging and reclassifying specimens at the Academy of Natural Sciences. And he gets a couple of publications out of this. So he published a few papers as a teenager, which was the beginning of his incredibly prolific writing career. I mean, this guy has maybe the record for most academic publications, like more than Paul Erdős, and died at 56. So yeah, he did that partly by rushing a ton, but also by starting weirdly young.
Yeah.
And then, sort of over the course of his late adolescence, early 20s, things start to get really politically weird in the United States. And also, he had this girlfriend. Not a lot of information comes down to us about the girlfriend. We don't know who she was, but he had some kind of girlfriend. And he was thinking about asking her to marry him, and then she dumped him.
Ooh.
And there was, I think, maybe, like, some talk of them getting back together, and also he was starting to make noises about maybe wanting to be a battlefield nurse. And his father was like, you're going to Europe.
Again, the privileges of having a wealthy background.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely not, Edward. Go away. Leave the continent.
You're going to be out there getting distracted by frogs, and it's not going to be good for you.
Yeah, no, not a chance. He's scared of guns, too.
Right, yes.
And there's this girl, and he won't drop the girlfriend issue. And, you know, most of the time it's useful to be a young, able-bodied man, but then sometimes war breaks out.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So his father sends him on sort of a grand tour, and this begins in 1863. He goes to Berlin, and he takes an anatomy course at the university in Berlin, where Othniel Marsh is studying.
Bum, bum, bum.
And so Marsh is a decade older than Cope. Marsh has had a much slower start to his academic career, but in some ways he is on paper more accomplished. He has a professorship at Yale, and he's doing this, like, not even a sabbatical. He hadn't been a professor for very long. I don't know why. I don't know what he was doing there, but it was justified somehow, apparently, in the eyes of Yale University.
We'll talk about that in a Marsh episode someday.
Yeah, I don't know what was going on with that, but Marsh was studying in Berlin. He's in his early 30s. So Cope happens upon this guy who has similar interests and is a fellow American. And they hit it off. They become friends. They spend some time together. Cope was sort of on and off in Berlin for about 3 months, and for some of that time they stayed together. Then he goes to Paris and somewhere else. I don't remember all of the destinations on this European tour. And then he decides to burn all of his personal correspondence and his journals. And there are a lot of things that could have gone down there. He sure was, like, want to get into all kinds of emotional and social trouble. Like, this was a consistent theme. But it was also immediately after meeting the guy who would go on to get under his skin so much that he dedicated, like, the entire rest of his career to their rivalry. And I do wonder if maybe one of the weird things that happened that precipitated this nobody can know what I was writing about breakdown had something to do with Marsh.
Yeah. I mean, it would make, especially since it's like correspondence and stuff.
Yep.
That something got said and you went, nope, that's not making it into the history books.
I'm erasing the letters you wrote me.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And it's like, I tell this story to people and they're like, okay, did they hook up? And I'm like, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It sounds like a breakup.
Or they killed someone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, something weird happened. Like, all of the things that aren't sex are weirder.
Yes, right?
Yes.
That is by far the most Occam's razor, just easy answer. And then everything else is like, all right, so how many...
Whatever happened, it was like a 90s summer movie.
Yes, exactly.
It was the plot of a 90s summer. It was Eurotrip, or it was... What's the other Europe one? There's two. I always like Eurotrip, and then there's another one that I always think of.
Yeah, I can't remember. The one that came to my brain was a White Castle or
yes. Or it was Harold and Kumar, or it was Not Another Teen Movie.
Yeah.
Some sort of young person nonsense happened, and then you had to leave.
Yep.
Weird hijinks. Weird hijinks went down, and we'll never know what. And I think it had something to do with Marsh. At least some of it had something to do with Marsh. Interestingly, this, I think, surprisingly credulous biographer says, when commenting on this and the fact that they met in Berlin and became friends there, she says, well, there's no mention of Marsh in the letters he didn't burn. So maybe Marsh didn't make much of an impression. And I'm like... It's giving we should reinforce the airplanes in the places the ones that returned got shot.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, exactly.
It's a survivor bias. It's
like
he doesn't mention Marsh at all in these unburned letters.
Why did he burn the letters, Jane? Jane, why did he burn the letters?
Oh my goodness, that is such a that it's like a comedian wrote it.
So his introduction to science, right, him getting involved in paleontology, getting his start in science, seems to dovetail with him also getting his start in making the kind of relationships that he would become famous for having.
Yeah.
It seems like he was having a hard time from day one.
Yeah.
Yeah. An entirely self-created hard time.
Yes.
Yeah, did not make friends well.
Yes, the problems are coming from inside the house.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, a background of nothing but privilege, and also just constantly in emotional turmoil about it. Which, fair enough, sometimes I feel that way.
Absolutely, yeah. Still quite relatable.
Yeah,
So far, still very relatable.
Still very relatable. I've never written any eugenic theory about it, though, so, like, shoot me if I do.
Yes.
Not so much that part.
But by this point, he was already in touch with Joseph Leidy, or Lady. I have heard all three pronunciations.
Sure. I think we said lady in the Bone Wars episode.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So for
I'm
consistency,
gonna go with lady.
you can say lady. Leidy, dear listeners.
So by this point, he was already in touch with Joseph Leidy. He had taken a course in comparative anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania with Leidy immediately before going on this European Grand Tour. And he was writing, and he was very curious, and he was very prolific. And so, despite not having a university degree himself, when Marsh came back from Europe, he was basically immediately hired to a professorship at Haverford College in Pennsylvania, which happens to be my middle brother's alma mater. So that was a nice little connection.
Neat.
Yeah, right? And I didn't know any of this when my brother was there. So yeah, he's only 23. He's very precocious, and people are impressed. That's the stage. But he is clearly, on some level, not very impressed with himself.
Gotcha.
Dad hadn't told him he did a good job yet.
Yep.
Yeah. Also, at this point, again, he's like continuing to debate over letter and presumably also in person with his father about the value of studying science and teaching science. And no, I don't want to take over the farm.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, right. Also, when he was in Europe, he got to see Archaeopteryx, and that made an impression.
As it would.
How could it not?
Yeah.
On everybody. It was Archaeopteryx was making impressions in the 1860s. That was kind of its thing.
It sure was.
Yeah, so he comes back to the US, and walks straight into this professorship. He also gets married at this point to a, I think, second cousin. And it's not that he didn't like her, but it does kind of seem to have been a marriage of convenience. He's writing about her in these kind of like passionless language, like, I think she will be a good mother.
Yes, yeah.
Right, yeah.
I think she will be a stabilizing element in a household. Neither of those are direct quotes, but that's the vibe.
Sure. It feels reminiscent of Darwin's like pros and cons list for.
Yeah, I love this list. To marry, not to marry. Better than a dog anyhow.
yes, exactly.
Ugh.
And he didn't maintain this professorship at Haverford for very many years because shortly after this, he moved with his wife and his young daughter to New Jersey to prospect for fossils around Haddonfield, New Jersey, where he found the type specimen of what he called Laelaps, a name which turned out to be preoccupied and was later renamed Dryptosaurus. I'll give you one guess who was really excited to rename Cope's preoccupied genus.
This would be a trend. Of Marsh and Cope.
So by this point, he is prospecting for fossils. He's pulling stuff out of the ground in New Jersey. East Coast paleontology from the Mesozoic is tricky. I know you know this. For the audience, things just didn't like to fossilize in that time period. And so a lot of the stuff that he was discovering has like kind of never been seen or heard from since. Like, what was the deal with Dryptosaurus? What kind of guy was it?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll find more bits of it. Probably not.
Yeah.
And I think Dryptosaurus was the second dinosaur known from North America, or maybe the third after Hadrosaurus, which Lady named. So this discovery was a big deal and kind of made Cope's name even more than his name had already been made with, just sort of chugging away at these slightly less glamorous but very frequent publications. And then in 1867, this guy from Kansas sent him a bunch of bones. A big marine reptile. And Cope is like, fantastic, this is gonna make my career. second big publication.
This is going to be so. It's going to be so. People are going to be talking about this for years.
Yeah, they're gonna love this one. And so he spends like 2 years preparing this specimen. And in Cope's defense, the excavator told him where all of the bones had been found relative to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And in Cope's defense, Elasmosaurus had no business looking like that.
Yes.
It's a super weird animal.
Like that. Plesiosaurs are bizarre looking by today's standards, period.
And no one had seen them before this.
Yeah, this was not just a brand new guy, but a brand new type of guy.
Yes.
And usually when one end of an animal is really long and another end of an animal is kind of short and stumpy, the really long skinny protrusion is the tail.
Yeah.
Plesiosaurs didn't look like that. Plesiosaurs had really weird long necks. And, I mean, stop me, correct me, or just cut this out if this is uninformed, but as far as I know, like, it is still, like, a big mystery what they were doing with these necks. Like, they weren't flexible enough for them to be obviously useful in, like, twisting around crevices, and they would have been a problem for hydrodynamics, and probably not sexual selection, but, like, they kept these super long necks throughout their entire existence as a group of animals, so what was going on with the necks? Like, in Cope's defense, the neck was weird.
Yeah, like,
yes,
we
absolutely.
still are trying to understand what's up with these necks.
Yes, episode 72.
Oh, very good. God, it's like quoting Bible verses, but more fun.
Man.
That is a comparison that's never been made before.
That needs to go on the website.
Yes. We'll quote a 72, David 72.
It's, the other comparison I nearly made was Ferengi Rules of Acquisition.
I don't even get
That's
this.
really good. It's a Star Trek thing. That's why you don't get it.
That's why I don't get it, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just a joke for the Trekkies at home. Where was I? Right, okay, so Cope made a mistake. He made a lot of mistakes that were definitely his fault. I'm inclined to give him grace for this one. His friend Othniel Marsh paid him a visit at this lab where he was preparing this specimen after the paper had been submitted, after the reconstruction drawings and the diagrams had already been made and already been submitted with this paper. And Marsh was really harsh about that in a way that Cope really didn't like. Or maybe Marsh wasn't harsh. Marsh claims he was very reasonable about this. Cope claims he was, like, cruel and rubbed his face in it, and we'll never know. It was probably somewhere in between.
Yes.
Sure.
Yep.
It will be important, I think, throughout this episode discussion that because Cope is the focus here, there's probably going to be a bunch of places where it seems like Marsh is the victim.
Yeah.
And that's not really a fair reading of Marsh
These are,
for the most part.
Two incredibly unreliable narrators.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Marsh was also a bad person.
Yeah, no, my in a word, my read on the situation is Cope was fragile and Marsh was tactless.
Yes, that absolutely seems to be the clash here.
And from there, you know, the ball rolled in slow motion all the way down that hill.
Yes.
So the short and sweet explanation here is Cope put the head on the wrong end of the skeleton, and Marsh was a jerk about it.
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have, like, opened with a more explicit, like, by the way, he put the head on the tail.
Yeah.
But yeah, enough about the weird conflict stuff.
Sure.
Because we're kind of not there yet. Anyway,
Yes.
the point is, he has some big deal discoveries under his belt. By this point, as a relatively young man, and especially impressively as a young man with not a lot of formal training. Like, you can say a lot of things about Edward Cope. You can't say he didn't want it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, he wanted to be good at this, and he sure did put in work about it.
So Cope gets a good start in his science career. He's met a bunch of impressive sciencey folks. He's done some impressive sciencey work. Zooming forward a bit to sort of take the broad view of Cope's scientific career, what sort of work does Cope end up getting into as a scientist? Because this is another thing that is famous about Cope, is that he didn't just do one thing. Cope was very broad in his interests.
Yeah, so Cope was, like, in a word, prolific. If anyone's playing a drinking game at home, by the way, drink every time I say prolific. You might die.
Please drink responsibly.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, maybe don't. I don't know. You could. You could if you wanted to. I'm not your dad. I think I'm not your dad is maybe the subtitle of this episode. Okay, so Cope described a lot of fossil animals that are kind of household names, and also a lot of ones that are not household names.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the ones that people are most likely to have heard of are Camarasaurus, that came out pretty early in his scientific career. Elasmosaurus was as we just discussed, like, Elasmosaurus is all over the, like, you know, child's bedspread seascape of the Mesozoic prints and stuff.
Yes,
like
those long-necked marine reptiles.
Yeah.
Like, if you've seen a picture of plesiosaur, it's very likely it was a rendition of Elasmosaurus.
Mm-hmm. And then he also named Dimetrodon.
Mm-hmm. The most famous not dinosaur.
Yep.
Yeah, the famous not dinosaur. He also named Coelophysis. I think he named, I forgot where I wrote this number down. I think he named 56 different genera of dinosaurs. And I don't know if that's before or after, like, some of them were obviated because of his own sloppy work.
Yeah, this is one of those places where when we compare Cope and Marsh, this is one of the places where Marsh wins out. That they both named a bunch of names. Cope named a lot more dinosaurs than Marsh did, but a lot fewer of them are still valid names.
Yep.
Because he was a sloppy scientist.
Yeah. Which is not to say that Marsh didn't also do his own fair share of rush work.
Yes. Absolutely.
I have a cuddly toy stuffed sauropod that lives in my room at home, and it is called Othniel the Apatobrontosaurus. So now I just need a cuddly Dimetrodon and to call it Edward.
There you go.
And I'll make them sit together on a shelf and talk it out.
You need a "This is our get along" T-shirt to put them in.
Yeah. So anyway, yes, prolific. He named a whole bunch of small animals as well, both in the fossil record and among extant animals. I think 300 reptiles, 300 fish, approximately.
Wow.
So one of the things that I was reading to mug up for this episode was Edwin Colbert's The Great Dinosaur Hunters and Their Discoveries. And he makes the point that Cope is kind of a patron saint of, like, small animal paleontologists and like sort of small herpetological paleontology.
Yeah, he has a journal named after him.
Or he did.
Well, he did. It's true. He did have a journal named after him, which was Copia, which was a journal of reptiles, amphibians, and fish.
Yes.
It was renamed Ichthyology and Herpetology, or maybe Herpetology and Ichthyology, because of all of the eugenics he shouldn't have been saying.
Yes.
Which was a very reasonable call on their part. It's exactly what I would have done. I think it would be really funny to start calling the historical Cope Ichthyology and Herpetology.
Edward Drinker, Ichthyology and Herpetology.
Yeah, it's a niche joke with a target audience of like 6 people, but I think it's funny.
But half of those people are in this discussion, so it's a real hit here.
And the rest of them are listening.
Yes, yes, they are.
But yeah, so he really put in the work on some kind of unglamorous animals and seemed genuinely passionate and interested in them in a way that is like a big part of his legacy, I think, within the scientific community and among like herpetologists and ichthyologists.
He also was very, you've said prolific several times. You mentioned earlier that he has possibly the record for number of scientific articles published. He also held a bunch of positions. What are some of his, what goes on his CV?
Right. Okay. So he was a professor at Haverford at 23. I mentioned that. Mm-hmm. Towards the end of his life, he had a different professorship at the University of Pennsylvania. He was awarded the Bigsby Medal of the Geological Society of London in 1879. Marsh had won the same medal in 77. He also received the Hayden Memorial Geological Award of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia in 1891. This was the same institution where he kept showing up with frogs as a child, so that's quite sweet.
That is very sweet.
He was the owner of the American Naturalist Journal for many years.
That's right.
Which is funny for reasons that will come up in a later section of this episode. He published I'm not going to go through and count this guy's papers. I don't know who to believe. Like at least 1400, about 1400,
Mhm.
almost 1400, or specifically 1395 are all numbers that I have heard for the number of papers that Cope published.
Either way, far too many.
Far too many papers.
So many. Just an insane number.
That's incredible.
In like 30 years.
Yeah.
That's quite, I guess like 40 years. That's quite a lot.
Okay, so he is surpassed by Paul Erdős, the mathematician, who is, like, I think best known for having published an insane number of papers.
Sure.
But not by very much. Like, similar. These are approximately Paul Erdős numbers. It's like 1400 versus 1500. He was also a theorist. He's best known for, like, classifying and naming. But he also published quite a bit of theory about evolution and what he thought was more likely than Darwinian evolution.
Mhm.
Some of these ideas were kind of mainstream, at least at the time. Some of them are really out there, and everything in between. He wrote this paper called "On the Origin of Genera," which was a response to "On the Origin of Species."
That sounds very much like a thing Cope would have done.
Yeah. It's one of those where it's like, that's so obnoxious, but also I kind of have to give you kudos. That's well played.
And to be fair to the title, the thesis of the paper is the origin of genera is not like the origin of species.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
So he makes the claim that the evolution of higher level groups, or at least higher level than species, operates under very different mechanisms from the evolution of species, and that that survival of the fittest and natural selection did not apply to the evolution of higher level groups. That instead there was this kind of like there was a goal, there was some unseen guiding force with a plan.
Yeah.
Which I will refer back to the fact that Cope was raised Quaker.
Yeah.
And this is theological kind of in general. I think if any scientist said this, you would assume that there was some God going on in this guy's brain.
Yes.
So he gave this talk called The Theology of Evolution, in which he outlined some kind of outlandish ideas about like God being present in everything, which are kind of poetic and also kind of scientifically weird.
Mhm.
Like everything is conscious. My source is everything responds to stimuli. That's a possible. I could stretch the definition of consciousness to that.
Yes.
Rocks are often made up of fossils. Fossils used to be animals. Maybe all rocks used to be alive. Maybe everything is conscious, therefore God, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't stand up to 21st century scientific scrutiny, but it's interesting and it's kind of poetic.
Yeah, well, this was a time where a lot of early scientists in general, including in paleontology, did dovetail quite a bit with theology and philosophy. You know, Darwin famously almost ended up being clergy, and you have a lot of early scientists who were also reverends or religious people of religious importance. There was still this very tight connection there.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting seeing the ideas that got thrown around and tested out during this exploratory time.
Yeah.
It's very much like the spontaneous generation and learning about those old ideas on how we thought nature worked. It's same with when evolution, our modern idea of evolution was taking form. A lot of those kinds of ideas popped up. It's interesting to know that Cope also was coping with this topic.
He was ichthyology and herpetology.
He sure was. And honestly, like, I think if you can be a little bit flexible in your understanding of what it means for something to be divine, I think it makes perfect sense I think, like, evolution and paleontology and divinity are, like, absolutely concepts that go hand in hand if you have a sort of flexible and non-literal understanding of what that means. Like, nothing will make you feel a sense of awe and simultaneous importance and insignificance, like, you know, holding a broken bit of some little creature that, you know, is a fellow earth animal that experienced pain and used to be a baby.
Well, and it makes sense that these topics overlap in the thinking, especially when they were the fields were being formed, because they all deal with asking big foundational questions of like, where did life come from? And like same reason that studying space can have that effect of how did the universe, and you're asking these questions that we may never be able to fully answer just because of how the information we have access to works. So of course you're going to have overlap in maybe the answer's kind of over here, or maybe it's kind of over here. So it makes sense.
Absolutely. So Cope is very much like, as were every other person writing about deep time and evolution and paleontology in the 19th century, he was very much grappling with this, and he has objections to Darwinian evolution, but also he believes in a kind of evolution, but he's not entirely convinced by the natural selection thing.
Yeah.
Also, in Origin of Genera, he proposes an idea which would go on to show up in a lot of what he's the most messed up eugenic stuff that he went on to write, which is this idea of basically paedomorphosis and paramorphosis. But he has special terms for them, and he attributes all large-scale evolution to this. Acceleration and retardation, that's what he calls it. So it's the idea that change in taxa over time happens because some of them have like an accelerated development, and so they go on to develop more. In modern biology, for those of you listening at home, this is called paramorphosis. Approximately, I'm defining it in kind of with a sledgehammer here.
Sure.
And sometimes development or like evolutionary change happens because things remain in a juvenile state. And Cope says that this is a kind of regression that can happen, so things can go back to a more juvenile state, but more importantly, the juvenile states of higher or more advanced organisms resemble the adult states of less advanced organisms.
Yeah.
And this is all over the stuff that he had to say about humans.
Yeah.
Which brings me to, we're going to touch on this more later. I have the outline in front of me as well. But which brings me to like the darkest part of Cope's scientific contributions, because Cope was a committed eugenicist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, like, if you scratch the surface of the body of work of anyone who was writing in this field or an adjacent field in this time period, you will find material with which you could make a case that this person was promoting eugenic ideas.
Yeah.
Right.
There is no ambiguity with Cope. He was enthusiastic about it. He was contributing actively. He was innovating on scientific racism in ways that went on to be actually influential in horrific ways.
Yeah.
He was very committed to this, and it was important to him. And his bigotry was diverse and multi-directional. He was a misogynist. He was a racist. He was a racist in ways that are kind of like old-timey and weird today.
Outdated racism, which all of it is, but
yes, right.
particularly so.
Exactly. He has a lot to say about the Irish. He has a lot to say about Southern Europeans.
Yeah.
He has a lot to say about Africans. He has a lot to say about women. None of it is good. He has a lot to say about the lower classes also.
Yeah, yes. This is something that has been very persistent in the history of science, is scientists attempting to use the most up-to-date scientific understanding to reinforce their pre-existing cultural views about the hierarchy of people.
Yes.
That if you can say, well, I, as a scientist in the mid-1800s, I already know that women are lesser than men. I already know that white people are more advanced than black people. Where's the evidence that I can find in the science that shows this point? And the answer is there isn't evidence in the science that shows those points, because those things aren't true.
Yep.
Those are cultural biases, but you get tons of examples of scientists trying to marry those two.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is somebody who started out racist and tried to invent science to justify it.
Yes.
When surely there's a logic to it, because I can't be wrong.
Yes, exactly.
No, I'm smart. I'm educated. I'm I'm Mr. Good Idea Haver, publisher of so many papers.
Yes.
My dad says I'm really smart and successful.
I'm so good at looking at bones.
Very Leonardo DiCaprio and Django Unchained.
Yes. Yep.
Scientific racism.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm great at looking at bones, and I'm so objective and not emotional because I'm not a woman.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can trust me. Here's my paper on why I'm more trustworthy.
Here's my paper and my beard.
Yes, 100%.
Oh, gross.
So, okay, and to clarify on the this like acceleration and retardation thing, Cope wasn't the first person to talk about this or the only person to talk about it, but he was one of its earlier adopters. The first person to talk about it was this French guy, Etienne or Etienne. Etienne Serre in 1860 called it the theory of recapitulation.
Okay.
And Cope refined this, which is a term that feels weird to use considering that both of them were wrong.
Yes.
But like,
He streamlined his wrongness.
yeah, like sometimes paedomorphic and paramorphic evolution happen. They're not the reason why all evolution happens, and
Yes.
they certainly don't justify any weird claims about human hierarchies.
Well, and they aren't a version of progress and anti-progress. They're just both phenomena that can happen within evolution.
Yeah. Oh god, people are so uncomfortable with evolution being neutral.
Yep.
With like the neutrality of Earth and its processes.
Yes.
This is my number one bugbear as a science communicator. People are like, well, can you tell me why humans are special? And I'm like, I have news for you.
Yep.
Special isn't real in nature.
Yep.
So we are starting to get into these questions. What we've been alluding to this entire time. Here on the outline for this episode, I have split the different sections into different subheadings. The first part about his early life was Cope the person, and then we talked about Cope the scientist. The next section on the outline is called Cope the problem,
Yep.
which I'm very excited to get to. We're going to take a short break, and then after this brief musical interlude, we will talk about the other stuff he's famous for.
Problematic Cope.
Yes. So, as we have been foreshadowing for this entire episode discussion so far,
Ever so subtly.
Edward Drinker Cope, amidst the many things that he is famous for, is perhaps most famous for being infamous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Continuing on from where we kind of left off in his scientific contributions, we'll get to who he was as a person, but staying with the science theme for the time being, let's talk a bit more about sort of his problematic science.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I think is important not to downplay or lose in the conversation is just how consequential Cope's contributions to scientific racism were. Not only are his claims about non-white races and about certain people within white groups atrocious and incredibly cruel and insulting just to read and to look at, but they had real-world consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Most heinously, Cope is intellectually 2 degrees of separation from Adolf Hitler. He was a huge influence on and lifelong close friend of Henry Fairfield Osborn.
Lightning, thunder.
Who is, in addition to having been a successful dinosaur paleontologist, was also a intellectual influence on the eugenic ideas of Adolf Hitler. It's not a long meandering path, it's very direct.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned before, his bigotry is diverse. He's anti-black, he's anti-Asian, he's an anti-Semite, he's anti-Irish, he's anti-Southern European, he's very anti. Man loved to be anti. I'm gonna pull a quote just because it's uncomfortable. Have we not burdens enough to carry in the European peasantry which we are called on every year to receive and assimilate? Is our own race on a plane sufficiently high to render it safe for us to carry 8 millions of dead material in the very center of our vital organism?
Wow.
Which is a crazy thing to say about European immigration. It is worse because the context is this is his case for deporting all of the African Americans to Africa.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Jeez. Yeah, like just like you were saying, not just because there's tons of, and this comes up whenever we do historical figures.
Yes.
Old people from previous times have previous ideas, and many of those are very problematic by our current view on society and understanding of things. But he was not just a product of his time. He was
His time was a product of him.
Yeah, he was
he was a pioneer.
Yes, yeah, he perpetuated the things that were wrong with his time in many ways. That's intense.
Yeah, and a lot of it is this grotesque.
Mm-hmm.
There are at least a couple historical scientists who have said things about human beings which are off color now.
Yes.
Which of whom I am interested in mounting a nuanced defense.
Mm-hmm.
Like a criticism in which there is some, okay, this is also somebody who is actively grappling with the ideas of his time. This is somebody who is like critically examining these views with a view to understanding if they are true, or perhaps, this is somebody using language that doesn't mean what it meant then.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such defense of Edward Cope.
And
Right.
so often insensitive things can be born from ignorance that
Yeah.
Sure.
you have overstepped the things you're commenting on, and you are now saying inappropriate things. This is not that.
Absolutely. And when he wasn't being an interpersonal nightmare, when he wasn't picking fights and being fragile and weird about his friends, he was generally kind of fun to be around, is sort of the overall gist I get from this. Like, he was mostly nice to people. He was mostly welcoming. He would be, like, very enthusiastic about people walking into the museum where his friends worked and showing them around, whether it was, like an urchin off the street or some young girl, or I think there are stories of him having positive interactions with people from groups he was on record bigoted against.
Yeah.
And the bigotry is so grotesque that actually I think rather than being a defense of it, that even like makes it look kind of worse.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is somebody who's so committed to his scientific racism and his scientific misogyny and everything else and the classism that even while on one level recognizing shared humanity enough to like have a personal chat, he can still remain committed to these ideas. And that's like somehow more twisted than if he isolated himself from those groups.
Yeah. He was a gross person.
Yes. Incredibly so.
Also, I am allowed to find the misogyny funny, and for the duration of this segment, I give you permission to find it funny also. When this episode ends, your permission is revoked.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. We are especially in these episodes, the historical figure episodes, we are constantly grappling with trying to find the balance between how much is it okay to laugh at these, right? What is the appropriate level of emotional response to how Nopcha dies?
Yes.
That is both respectful of the people we're talking about and respectful of the people who are listening to us.
Yeah. Well, so many of these historical figures were ridiculous people.
Yes, cartoonishly bad.
So you want to laugh at them, but then every now and then you have to go, also, he was a eugenicist, and also he was a murderer.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we need to factor that in. You
Exactly.
can't just laugh at them. They're not clowns. They were people that did ridiculous and often horrifying things.
Yes.
Exactly. And I'm not comfortable laughing at the racism. I am comfortable laughing at the misogyny.
Sure.
That's my business. Like, this guy would have, do you have any idea how much this guy would have hated me? This guy would have hated me so much. Like, I am a butch lesbian paleontologist.
Yeah. And you're also like enthusiastic and outspoken.
Yes.
Which is the worst kind of butch
just
lesbian.
Absolutely
paleontologist.
Nothing about me would have made him anything other than horrified. Right, so so first of all, a eugenicist, a misogynist, and a neo-Lamarckian walk into a bar. All of them are Edward Cope. I'm obsessed with this take because he really couldn't have come to this conclusion without all three of its component bad opinions. The take is, women shouldn't be empowered in society and women shouldn't have jobs because by exercising their muscles, they will evolve into men. And then society will fall apart. Like, you have to be all three of those things in order to come to this insane conclusion.
Wow.
It's like peak scientific discrimination.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, wow, check, like you win a special prize for catching them all, and the prize is women might evolve into men with muscle gains and destroy society. I think it would be kind of fun and flirty to destroy society with the power of muscle gains. I'm working on
Absolutely.
it.
Right?
We support you. If you want to
Thank
evolve
you.
into
Wish
a
me
man
luck.
and destroy society,
Yes.
we'll be cheering for you. These are the kinds of things where it is important for us to find that balance between this is utterly ridiculous.
Yeah,
that is cartoonishly silly.
Well,
It's bonkers.
I would expect a scientist in a Mel Brooks movie
Absolutely.
to be being like, you want to be careful.
But yeah, he's like a cartoon character.
Yeah, exactly.
But then at the same time, this was a highly influential, highly respected scientific authority at the time. So this is like if a popular science communicator, like if Bill Nye came out and said something like this, and it's like, okay, that's cartoonish and ridiculous, but also people like and respect that guy.
Yep.
And so it's also horrifying.
Yes.
It's also deeply disturbing.
Well, it has the toxic masculinity podcast sort of thing of like, yeah, the things they're saying are ridiculous, but people are listening and it's having an effect.
Yeah. And I think it's also especially dangerous because he is both he's synthesizing ideas that were popular in this day and taking them further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, these ideas are mainstream enough that they were accepted, at least in some circles, and then he made them worse. Whereas if they had been streets worse than everything that his contemporaries were saying, it wouldn't have been as dangerous.
Yes.
People wouldn't have listened to him. But like, this was believable in 1880.
And he's adding the seeming legitimacy of science to these horrible views and opinions. So for those that are learning about what he's saying, but not actually part of the scientific community, it's got that thing of, well, but
The scientist said it.
Yeah. It was, the Neil deGrasse Tyson said that movie was bad. So that movie was bad.
Right.
It's got that sort of thing of, because a scientist said it, surely, and I agree with what they said.
Yeah.
It backs up the way I feel about women or other races. So surely I'm even more right than I was yesterday.
This is why I try really hard not to use phrases like science says in my own science communication, unless I'm obviously doing a bit, and even then I try to, just do the bit differently. Because I do think it is very, very common to believe that science is this, like, science with a capital S, is this, like, unwavering authority that gets opinions straight from the hand of God. And science is a process made up of the actions of a whole bunch of individuals, every single one of whom is just some guy, just like you. And those people can be wrong, and the reason why science works as an epistemological process is because ideally it can correct itself.
Yeah.
So, science says, parentheses, this jerk from 1880.
Yes, exactly.
He complained about, I guess, like, first wave male feminists. He calls them, like, effeminate and long-haired, which is a direct quote. Which is, like, great. Tale as old as time. I'm glad the misogynistic man tradition of calling male feminists effeminate is as old as feminism.
Yep.
Yes. Well, what worse thing could you say about them?
Absolutely.
Right, yeah, exactly. Like, we've already agreed that women are inferior, so...
Yes. There could be no greater insult.
Those are some men in need of some evolution.
The spiciest thing that Cope said about gender, though, is I think also kind of revealing about his interpersonal weirdness and his insecurities and his, like, just the famous problems with Cope, the famous and funny problems with Cope, which is, I quote, "Probably most men can recollect some early period of their lives when the emotional nature predominated, a time when emotion at the sight of suffering was more easily stirred than in maturer years. Perhaps all men can recall a period of youth when they were hero worshippers, when they felt the need of a stronger arm and loved to look up to the powerful friend who could sympathize with and aid them. This is the woman stage of character.
Oh.
Doesn't everybody at one point, when they're young, want to be held in the arms of a big, strong man? And then we grow out of it because we realize that that's what women do, and we don't want to be like that. Everyone has that, right? Everybody went through that.
This is universal.
Edward!
Yeah.
You good, man?
It's just, I'm, and not like he would have ever gone to therapy in his life, but like just the therapist across going, all right, so there's a lot to unpack here.
Men will literally publish 1,400 scientific publications instead of going to therapy.
Men will literally write 1,000 fish papers instead of going to therapy.
Yeah.
Men will literally explode every fossiliferous hillside in Montana instead of going to therapy.
No, I absolutely agree. That is like you opened a window into your soul more than you realized with writing that down.
Well, you didn't need to tell us that.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, before, not to go, to jump too deep into the psychoanalyzing this person and suggesting something about his gender identity or whatnot. But at the very least, it sounds like this was a guy who was grappling with how he related to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned with his father, and how he related to other people in his field of science, and seems to have whatever was actually going on inside of this person seems to have manifested those feelings in very unhealthy ways.
Well, and turned them outward at society through his scientific influence.
Mm-hmm. And there's something, I have no idea what kind of person Edward Cope would be if he had been born in 1995.
Mm-hmm,
maybe he would be the exact same guy. Like, maybe he would have caused all of the same problems. Probably with less dynamite. We don't have quite as much of that lying around now. But, maybe he would have been the exact same guy. Maybe he would have identified as some flavor of queer. Which flavor? Shrug. Could be any of them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there's something going on with the sex and gender thing, right? And a lot of the attacks that he levels at, or criticisms he makes against women and womanhood and the character of women, are qualities that he either admitted to worrying about having, or that his friends of his said that he had. Like, women are emotional. Women are emotionally volatile. Women are so influenced by the people around them. Women can't let things go. Women are childlike because they want a big, strong daddy to look after them. Like, yes. It's like he's a misogynist against the parts of himself that he sees as too effeminate.
Yeah, that's sure. Very much the vibe I got.
I think that's a way of saying that without making any explicit claims about, like, what kind of person he would be in the 21st century or what kinds of labels might apply to him. And I have known heterosexual cisgender men who experience some weird flavor of internalized misogyny. Like, they see themselves as effeminate, and that is, rather than a truly outward-facing issue with women and femaleness, like, their misogyny is against this, like, weird fear about not being men, or being men wrong, or being feminine. Like, it's about himself.
Yeah, it's the famous saying that misogyny hurts both sides.
Yeah.
It is bad for everybody. And
absolutely.
That quote definitely also imbibes me of, like, this was not a happy person.
Right.
Like, obviously.
I think that this is a great moment for me to share a piece of information that I learned not too long ago, which is that Othniel Charles Marsh, when he was in school, had earned the nickname from his friends, Daddy.
Oh.
Yeah, his classmates did call him that.
They called him that because he was older. That was the
yes.
joke, was because
he
was
older.
And
it was like us calling someone grandpa.
Absolutely, yes.
Exactly. No, they were, in the Marsh case, it was his peers were making fun of him for being an unconventional student.
Yes.
Yes.
But it does play weirdly with the Cope narrative, doesn't it?
The Cope story, like Will said before, Cope's life is a very well-written story.
Yes. Oh yeah. Whoever your screenwriter was on it.
Yeah, it's got motifs. Real life isn't supposed to have those.
Yeah, right?
Now, I do
Why are
want
there motifs?
to latch onto a couple of comments that you made there to sort of segue us semi-awkwardly forward into the next section of conversation, which is that you mentioned dynamite a couple of times.
Yep.
And we've been talking a lot about Cope's problematic science in the realm of evolutionary science and such. He was also a problematic paleontologist.
Yes.
Yeah. He was doing bad science and he was doing bad things to science.
Yes.
Yes. And this does dovetail neatly with, of course, the Bone Wars.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yes.
Obviously, the most famous thing between Cope and Marsh was that they had this big fight between just the two of them and every paleontologist in North America.
Mm-hmm.
That was the Bone Wars. We did a whole episode about the Bone Wars, episode 58, so we won't go into super detail here. But Astrid, I would love for you to talk a bit about Cope as a paleontologist more specifically, and the ways that he was Cope as a paleontologist and where the Bone Wars fits into that.
So I think Cope seems to have had an issue with arrogance in a lot of ways, but including as a scientist and as pertained to his scientific work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this might partly have to do with the fact that he was not university trained, that he didn't come from that kind of sort of like mentor-student relationship that ideally trains scientific workers to check their work against the knowledge of experts, because that is something that he didn't do very much. He wrote very, very quickly, and he published very quickly. He, on at least one occasion, lied about when he had submitted papers to guarantee that he would get priority in the naming process of an organism.
Mm-hmm.
Guess who gleefully pointed that out in print? So he's infamous for naming the same animal twice, which is an issue that Marsh also had.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, I found this crappy little non-diagnostic lump of a something. I'm giving it this name. I found this other crappy non-diagnostic lump of a something. I'm giving it another name. And then, like, they're still cleaning up this mess.
Mm-hmm.
Right. There was this rush to put so many names on things and get so many papers out that a lot of it was done with what today, and even back then, would be considered insufficient evidence and insufficient material to do that.
Yeah. And it's frustrating the way that this has kind of played into young Earth creationist discourse a little bit, which unfortunately I learn a lot about because I have comment sections.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
That people who think that part or all of the field of paleontology is this, like, anti-Christian fraud get wind of the notion that there was academic misconduct and scientific fraud involved in the Bone Wars, and assume that that means that specimens were fabricated wholesale.
Yes.
And as far as I know, that never happened in the Bone Wars.
Same. This is something that we've brought up actually in some of the conversations we've had along these very same lines. The Bone Wars is often held up by people from all backgrounds who want to discredit paleontology.
Yes.
Well, here was a time where scientists were just making stuff up. And in reality, there wasn't really very much making stuff up in the Bone Wars. There was a lot of careless mistakes.
Yes.
There was a lot of unethical behavior, but there wasn't actually a lot of, I made up an animal and gave it a name.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you are too busy being obsessed with Othniel Marsh and or too afraid of criticism to show your work to a more senior scientist, then mistakes are going to get through into the publication. But that doesn't mean the bones weren't real.
Yes.
And for the most part, the fraud that was committed by both Cope and Marsh as part of the Bone Wars was very nerdy and academic and technical, like lying about the date on which you submitted a paper to guarantee that your paper was first past the post and you got to name the creature.
Yes.
Or, in Marsh's case, taking credit for other people's work.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which, for all of Cope's crimes against paleontology, humanity, and everything in between, he doesn't seem to have been a plagiarist.
Say what you will about the guy. He used his own words.
He used his own words, and a lot of them were crazy.
Yes.
He can't blame anyone else for the things he said.
See, if Marsh had published a bunch of, like, wacky eugenic stuff, there might be a defense there.
Right. So I'm so sorry. I plagiarized. I didn't read it thoroughly.
I plagiarized a eugenicist. No, he is the eugenicist.
Yep. Oh.
So, and then there's also the legacy of destruction of specimens.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which I believe they both participated in. I don't know the stories quite well enough to make a claim about, like, which one of them was worse on this front, but, like, both of them engaged in the practice of, like, here's a dig site. I think I've got everything I can out of it. I'm going to blow up this hillside so there's nothing left to find in here. And, like, we will never know what was lost in that process. Like, there are creatures that we could have been able to reconstruct, that could have got this, like, second life and told us so much about the ecology that they lived in and their evolution and their role in, like, the web of life. And we just this is not a victimless crime. Like, this specimen sabotage robbed the future of science from getting to learn all of that stuff, and that really sucks.
I think that's one of the reasons Cope, and he's not the only one, but one of the things that makes him stand out among, like, a lot of the other historical figures we talk about is very often we talk about, like, here's their contributions to science, and then here's the areas where they were a problematic human being. This was a flawed human that did flawed things.
Right.
Cope, and it's not that everything Cope did with science was bad, but, like, Cope was a bad person and a bad scientist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, even if you got rid of all of the horrifying racism and sexism, you were also a bad paleontologist.
He was unethical. He
Yeah.
was an unethical scientist.
Exactly. So, like, you don't even get to have that, like, but at least you were important, but we need to acknowledge. It's like, no, you also you did damage in every direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, unethical in ways that don't even touch on the social bigotry. I have had the privilege of getting to do some volunteer work for the Park Service, doing a little bit of fossil excavation, and not that I wasn't already sold on this concept, but it really made an impression on me, just the extent to which, like, the fossils that are part of the Earth are the people's fossils. Like, this is the legacy of all life on Earth. And anybody who damages it or steals it or hides it or destroys it is stealing from everybody.
Yes. This is not something that can be recreated, and it's the legacy of life on Earth. It's how we understand the history of our planet as a living thing. And if you get rid of that thing, there's no getting it back.
Yeah.
Well, and beyond the scientific issues and all of these problems, it sounds like Cope was also just a jerk to people.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, Marsh didn't like him, which, Marsh was no peach. But, like, Lady famously left dinosaur paleontology to get away from these people. Like, by all accounts, Cope was just not a nice person.
Yeah, or at the very least, he was such a volatile person that very few people got to know him well and ultimately concluded that they were, like, safe around him.
Yes.
He had one kind of, like, wacky lifelong friend who seemed to be able to match his energy. I don't know if you have heard any of these stories, but does the name Percifor Fraser ring a bell at all?
No, I don't think so.
That one I don't know.
So I don't really know anything about Percifor Fraser outside of the context of Cope's biography. I think he also did some scientific work. I don't know about what. And, like, my apologies. Actually, probably not. He was probably a eugenicist. Apology retracted.
Send in your request now for an episode about whatever this name is that Astrid has now said twice that I haven't internalized yet.
Yes.
Right. I mean, it's a weird name. Who calls their kid Percifor? But yeah, so with tentative apologies to the legacy of Percifor Fraser for not knowing anything about his scientific contributions.
It's pending. It's under review apologies.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sorry if he was a eugenicist.
Yes.
Maybe we should forget his contributions if those were they. Anyway, Fraser and Cope were lifelong friends. I think Fraser was a family friend. They were about the same age, so they had known each other from youth. Fraser was one of the 6 people who attended Cope's funeral.
This is a,
Man, there's a sentence.
8 if you count the reptiles.
what, 8, hang on. 8 if you count the reptiles?
Yeah, there was also a Gila monster and a turtle.
But they were forced to be there.
Yeah.
Their parents told them
That's
they
true.
had to come.
Yeah, they were just Cope's pets that were still
Yes.
there. Anyway, so Fraser and Cope had a fist fight. Hang on, I have notes on this, and these are not notes from when I was preparing for this. I happened upon this story, and it moved me to make a note with some detailed commentary on my computer. Okay, so 1888. Funnily enough, I don't think Cope is the bad guy in this story. Like, if this is an Am I the Bumhole Reddit post, I
Yes,
remembered that
yes.
time. I actually think Fraser... I think Fraser is in the wrong here, or at least Fraser is the one who's acting weirder. So it's 1888. Both of these men are in their late 40s at this point. These are grown men. These are not teenage boys. Fraser received a letter from Cope saying that an opinion that he had expressed was false and untrue. That's it. That's the whole inciting offense of this.
Sure.
So Fraser starts badgering Cope to apologize. Cope is not interested in apologizing. Says something weird about it. He's not like, I won't apologize because I stand by my words, your claim was false. It's, I'm not apologizing because you insulted me previously, so I get to insult you back, which is very Cope of him.
Yes. We're even.
So then Fraser stalks Cope, like, around the East Coast for a period of several weeks, trying to find him at some meeting or other. So he goes to the American Committee of the International Congress of Geologists on April 2nd, 1888, trying to catch Cope so he can, like, beef with him about this. Cope isn't there. Then he goes to, I think this is New York by this point. No, it was, the first thing was in New York. The second thing is maybe in Philadelphia. Maybe they're still in New York. I don't remember. Then he goes to the American Philosophical Society meeting. Ditches his wife at the opera to do this. Fraser promised his wife an opera date, and then he's like, hey, real quick, I gotta do something.
Got a text, just saw Cope.
So he goes to the American Philosophical Society meeting where Cope will maybe be in attendance. He's not sure Cope is going to show. But the chance that Cope might be there is worth ditching his wife at the opera about. Lo and behold, Cope is there. He corners Cope in the hallway and slaps him. At which point a fight breaks out, which is short-lived, and Fraser comes out on top very quickly. We have a detailed blow-by-blow for this, by the way, because Fraser wrote an account of it, which is, like, extremely detailed.
And then I give him a left,
Yes,
and then
yes.
I give him a right.
Here are the ways that I beat up my friend.
Woohoo!
Professor Cope, the simple question is, do you characterize what I wrote you as falsehood? Professor Cope replied, I do not know whether it is or not. At this instant, I struck him twice, hard in the face with my open hand. He gathered himself and plunged at me in the middle of the passage, not reaching me. I struck him several blows, one a hard one, after which he reeled and, stepping backwards, fell on the staircase, heading into the janitor's rooms overhead. As he rose, he clinched with me. I don't know what that means. That
Right.
feels old-timey. He
Yeah,
clinched with me, and I backed him to the wall, where first he and then I took one step upwards. I guess they're on a staircase at this point. He tried hard to throw me sideways, and at one instant nearly succeeded. Meantime, placing my elbow against his throat and forcing his neck against the wall, I held him motionless for some time.
I think that that such an important takeaway in the context of this episode is that this is a person that Cope was friends with for a long
I was
time.
just totally makes sense.
This is who comes to Cope's funeral.
Well, it's like when you in the comics when Wolverine's like, "This is my best friend. They just tried to kill me."
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it also raises, there's an obvious elephant in the room here. Oh, yeah, and then, so he goes on, like, he describes this short fight, which Fraser quickly won. And then another friend of theirs showed up and broke them up. And then Fraser returned to the meeting for a couple of talks. Cope came in afterwards, like adjusting his clothes and looking kind of beaten up. And then Fraser went and rejoined his wife at the opera, which was not yet over.
Sure.
So the obvious elephant in the room in this story is why, like, what's up with the Marsh thing then? Like,
Yeah.
clearly this is the kind of, if this is something that Cope could come back from as a friend,
Right.
what happened with Marsh?
Yeah, seriously.
What was in those burned letters?
Like, I don't think Marsh ever tried to strangle him.
Maybe if he had, maybe they would still be friends.
Yeah, that was
That's
it. That
true.
was the catharsis that they needed.
He didn't show he cared enough.
Yeah, put up or shut up. Absolute scenes at the American Philosophical Society, 1888.
Just wow.
So, yeah, there were two people who could match Cope's energy, apparently. Osborne on the eugenics stuff, who's also one of the 6 who attended the funeral.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Also, like, a true supervillain of early paleontology.
Yeah.
Henry Fairfield Osborne.
God, the nightmare blunt rotation of Osborne, Cope, and oh god, Owen. That's his name.
Which one's under the cup? You don't want to pick any of them. I suggest walking away.
Yes. So Osborne managed to match his energy on the crazy eugenic stuff, and Fraser matched his energy on the weird interpersonal violence.
Yeah.
And I guess Marsh matched his energy on the blowing up fossils in the field front.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
It's just a toxic human in so many ways.
So I think that we have reached a point in our narrative where it is now important to answer the question of how does this person's story end?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I would love to hear. I mean, love, that's a strong word, but I please tell us what's the end of Cope's life like? What how does he end up?
Yeah. So maybe there's some justice, I guess, in the fact that he did not ultimately profit from his nonsense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he began his life in a position of financial privilege, and he died poor and mostly alone.
That is satisfying, I will say.
Okay, so Cope invested a ton of money in silver mines in the early 1880s, around 1880, and lost a ton of money in these ventures. He also bought the American... Oh, right, I never mentioned why it's funny that he bought the American Naturalist. So Cope and Marsh spent like 2 years subtweeting each other in papers that they submitted to the Naturalist in the early 1870s until the editor of the Naturalist cut them off. There was an editorial that was like, Professor Marsh and Professor Cope are no longer allowed to comment on each other in papers submitted to this journal. If they want to comment on each other anymore, it can be in an appendix printed at the author's expense.
This is the scientific editorial version of, if you two can't get along, I'm going to have to separate you.
Yes.
Yeah, really. So at some point after that, Cope bought the Naturalist and also was losing money on that.
Sure.
So in the 1880s, he was having pretty significant financial trouble and slowed his field work. His last field expeditions were in the early 1890s. First in 1893 and 92 and 93, I think, on which he discovered some bones that he called Manospondylus gigas, which is a name that might ring a bell. Because it's
120.
Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Yeah.
And we kind of, I think we the paleontological community kind of got away with something by just like deciding to obviate that name because it wasn't very cool.
Yep.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That we bent the rules a little bit there.
Yeah. Because it was like, it's a couple of vertebrae. Like, there are valid taxa named on less than that.
Yeah.
It really just like your name sucks and you should feel bad.
Yes. Yep.
T-Rex is a better name, sorry.
Yep.
But yeah, on this South Dakota expedition, which was one of his last field expeditions, he technically became the person to discover T-Rex and decided it was like a ceratopsid, I think, and did some fairly sloppy work on it.
Mm-hmm.
Classic. As you do. He got this professorship at the University of Pennsylvania in 1889, and switched departments in 86 and became chair of zoology and comparative anatomy. Before that, he'd been a professor of geology. And 1896 was the year before he died. So over the course of the 1890s, he's having a lot of financial trouble. Would have preferred not to be like working a day job. I don't think he was very happy about this professorship, but it was like a regular salary and he needed that at that point. He he auctioned off a whole bunch of his personal collections of fossils. The Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, which was the site of his like boyhood paleontology mind-blowing event at the age of 6, declined to bid on them because by that point they also had bad blood with him.
Oh no.
Which would be more tragic if I were more inclined to feel bad for this guy, but yeah,
Yes.
that's the tragedy comes full circle.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And this is the part where we think about the enthusiastic and charming kid he was and go, didn't have to go this way.
Yeah.
It's a really, it's a very tragic tale.
It's got some Citizen Kane vibes and stuff. Well, yeah.
Yeah, it really does have Citizen Kane vibes.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wasn't feeling well. And he went, well, I'm very objective because I'm not a woman, so I can surely solve this problem myself. What if I take some opium and formaldehyde about it? Meanwhile, Osborne is begging him to come to New York and see a doctor and get a surgery, which, I mean, this was the 1890s. Who knows if this would have been effective? But Osborne believed that this surgery would have saved Cope. It was clear to Osborne that Cope was dying. It was not clear to Cope that Cope was dying. He was busy curing himself with opium and formaldehyde. And that went as well as one might expect. And he died in April of 1897 at the age of just 56. Which, again, really does drive home my goodness, and you really did write 1,400 papers in that time.
Yeah.
I did take when we were talking about it before, I took out my calculator, and if he wrote 1,400 papers over the course of 40 years, he was publishing a paper on average every 10 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Which is a preposterous amount, which also, to sort of double down on a lot of the things we've been talking about him, seems like an unhealthy relationship with your career that you've selected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
Yes.
I think this is maybe the gentlest critique any of us have made of Cope this whole episode. Like, bad work-life balance.
Yeah, you really bad. You had to take care of yourself better.
Unhealthy relationship to his work.
Yes.
If this guy had taken care of himself better, maybe he would have had better relationships.
Right.
It sounds like he ended his life having lost a lot of his money, having burned a lot of bridges with the people around him in his life, and not accepting help that he needed to get at the end of his life.
Yeah. He really, like, he was his own worst enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he died the way he lived.
Yeah. No, absolutely, though. It's very in character.
He also requested that his body be donated to science, partly because he wanted Marsh to donate his body to science so that they could find out whose brain was heavier.
Right, I forgot that he did that.
Marsh did not accept this challenge.
Didn't Cope also offer himself up to be the holotype for Homo sapiens?
So I went looking, so that's something that people say.
Mm-hmm.
I went looking for a source for that claim, and I couldn't find anything suggesting that came from Cope himself.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Cool.
I think
it just fits so well.
Yeah.
His personality.
I think Robert Bacher wanted Cope to be the holotype for Homo sapiens.
Oh, interesting.
I get the impression that he thought that was funny, but he's alive. We could ask him.
Yes,
I suppose.
we absolutely could. I do know that there's some story about Cope's skull that like traveled around to a bunch of different collections and stuff after he died.
There is a photograph of a young Robert Bacher measuring Cope's cranial capacity by pouring cooked spaghetti into it.
Yes. Yep, that is a thing.
As you do.
Yep.
That is the standard for measuring cranial capacity.
That's how we measure.
As we all know.
Way back in the first ever Darwin Day episode that we did, episode 28 about Charles Darwin, we ended the episode by asking our guest, Dr. Sarah Bray, to what extent Darwin deserves the legacy that he has and the fame that he has. And if you'd like to hear the conclusions we came to, go listen to episode 28, dear listeners. Cope has quite a legacy. And I think in some ways he is seen as an important foundational figure in paleontology. He paved the way, like you mentioned before, he was really important for early small mammal paleontology. One thing we didn't mention in this episode, but which did come up in episode 158, is that he was majorly influential on Charles Knight, the early the paleo artist, who was close with Cope and close with Osborne, and somehow managed, as far as I know, not to be a eugenicist.
we hope.
Here's hoping. Everything I've heard about the guy, he seems like a nice guy. He was a bit of a grouch, but episode 158, go check it out. Cope's legacy, he certainly is remembered for some of his influential pioneering things. He is absolutely remembered negatively for many of the reasons that we have discussed here in this episode. I guess I'm curious, and obviously we've been talking about this the whole time, but for a bit of a summation, I'm curious to end on the question of, to what extent does Cope deserve to be remembered as prominently and in the light that he is remembered these days?
So Cope is complicated, right? Like we've just spent 2 hours saying that in many different ways.
Yeah.
Cope did a lot of different things, and I think to a certain extent people seem to remember one side of him at a time. And I'm not entirely sure to what extent that is problematic or appropriate.
Yeah.
I do think that, the unglamorous vertebrate paleontology, the frogs and fishes, are important. And I think it's really cool that somebody was so dedicated to preserving and cataloging all of those little guys in these early days of vertebrate paleontology. I think there's a little bit, critiques of Cope as a person tend to focus a lot on Cope the clown and Cope the spectacle.
Yes.
In a way that I think downplays the extent to which some of his work was genuinely dangerous and had genuine serious consequences. Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe Cope as a whole person is a question for historians more than for paleontologists, I guess.
Sure.
I also, I'm willing to put a lukewarm and nuanced defense out there for the scientific work itself. Because he's famous for doing sloppy work, but also some of what he did is still used. And I guess if you write that much, some of it's going to be useful.
Right.
So yeah, I think he deserves to be laughed at because he's both unsympathetic and funny.
Yes.
But if anything, I wish that I felt like it was important when discussing him this evening to emphasize the extent to which some of it was actually dangerous.
Yeah. Well, and it's got, because it's so often easy to look back on a historical figure and boil them down to their hyperbole and the caricature that has been formed for them in movies and in actual cartoon rendition. What historical figure has not made an appearance on Animaniacs or something similar sort of thing. And so it's so easy to see the ridiculousness of their life that you can often forget that it's Genghis Khan was a bad person, did horrible
you heard
things.
It here first.
But we that's kind of a given, so we often just don't focus on it, that it can get forgotten. And Cope has that thing of, we talk about how extreme and ridiculous he was, even during the Bone Wars. They blew up fossils, and that gets overshadowed during the conversation of how ridiculous it was. No, stop. Blew up fossils.
Right.
That's arguably pretty evil. That's a horrifying thing to do.
I think that we kind of run into a little problem especially when we talk about early North American paleontology, and this is true, early English paleontology as well, is that there were only so many people.
Yes.
Right. There are only so many influential early North American paleontologists. So you kind of you can't talk about early North American paleontology without talking about Cope, and you can't understand North American paleontology without acknowledging and appreciating the importance his work played in the foundation of this field of science. And there were only like 12 famous names of guys back then doing this, so he's kind of inescapable.
Let's say whether his effects were for good or ill, he had a huge impact on the early years of paleontology. It would, like, you compare it to us getting a sense of his personality by the gravitational effects. It's the same thing of, like, even if you decided you weren't going to read about Cope, you'd be reading about Cope if you read about any aspect of the history of North American paleontology.
Yeah, well, like I said at the beginning, you observe his existence as it is implied in the effects it had on everything around it.
Yes.
Like the wobble of a star with an exoplanet.
It's you cannot disentangle his presence from that topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. The man, the myth, the monster.
The way that we talk about vertebrate paleontology, the way that it's understood, and the way that children enthuse about it would be so different if not for Cope.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to tell. Like, it's impossible to say how different it would be. Like, maybe, I don't know, would there still be dinosaur kids? Or would nerdy children be enthusiastic about some, like, I don't know, Permian megafauna or something?
Right.
Like, maybe we would have gorgonopsid kids instead.
Which I am perfectly pro for that.
Some of those are in our
I'm also kind of pro that. I think there should be more gorgonopsid kids.
Absolutely.
I think they need to make, like, a charming cartoon animated gorgonopsid movie for children.
Yes.
Agreed.
Mint a new generation of Permian paleontologists.
Gorgie and friends.
Astrid, this has been a delightful and entertaining and thought-provoking. I love that our talks about historical figures often end up going to these thought-provoking places because they force us to reflect upon the history of our own science.
Yeah, well, because we're talking about a person and all the complexities that go along with a human being.
Thank you so much for joining us and for waxing poetic and
critical.
Sure, yeah, some other word.
Just waxing in
just
general.
Waxing.
Just waxing.
I've just been waxing.
Waxing.
This has been tons of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dear listeners, we hope that you have enjoyed this deep dive into Edward Drinker Cope. In all of the facets, well, in some of the facets, there's so much. There are books that have been written about this person. Before we wrap everything up in this episode, there is one last thing for us to do, and that is our patron question. One of the benefits you can get by becoming a patron supporter of ours and supporting our science communication efforts on Patreon is that at certain levels, we will answer questions that you submit right here on the podcast. And when we have guests on, we love to welcome our guests to answer questions with us. I have selected what I think is a very Astrid question for this episode. This question comes from Lily, who asks, what are some of the oddest things people have named dinosaurs, and what do they mean?
Great. Well, I prepared 2.
Fantastic. Excellent.
I thought about throwing Penty Draco in there, but that's just Welsh, and I don't know. People make fun of the Welsh enough.
Fair.
Yes.
It's a bad look, also. I'm quasi-English. So, obviously, Drinker.
Yes.
After Edward Drinker Cope.
Absolutely. Who named Drinker?
Bacher, 1990.
I'm noticing a trend.
Yeah.
It's, I think, been obviated, or maybe not. I don't know.
Cool.
I didn't look very deeply into this. It's
Sure.
the same thing as Nanosaurus. But, like, yeah, out of context, yeah, they got a dinosaur called Drinker. The other one I have is Irritator.
Yes.
Which is a Spinosaurid from Brazil, and I went into the paper that described Irritator, and I quote, this is David Martel et al., 96, I think. I didn't write down the year, but I'm pretty sure it's 96. Etymology. From irritation, the feeling the authors felt, parentheses, understated here, when discovering that the snout had been artificially elongated. So the original pre-preparation of the holotype skull had artificially elongated the snout and obscured some damage to the specimen, and Marshall did not like that.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Oh, it's so good. I'm a big fan of pop culture names that have been like Gojirasaurus
Sure.
and those things.
Oh yeah.
I think those are fun, partially because like nerds are becoming paleontologists, and that's what happens.
Modern nerds.
Yes, exactly. Like nerds
Yeah.
of modern media are becoming paleontologists.
Nature is healing.
Yes. But also I love the idea of like way in the future how anachronistic a bunch of those names are going to be, and people being like, what does that mean? It was a reference to this old series of movies
With the walkie thingies.
And it's like, I would love to know what it will be like for people later on of, will those names be treated in the same pantheon as Triceratops and
Yes.
or will they be weird?
Yeah. Bambi Raptor.
Yeah,
Bambi
yeah.
Raptor, yep. Bambi
Meraxes, which sounds like it should be Greek. But I think it's one of the dragons from Game of Thrones, right?
Oh.
Meraxes is not. And I only know that because I know that that's not one of the dragons
Yep,
from Game
yep.
of Thrones. I don't know where Meraxes is from.
I
I
can't
don't know.
remember.
I think it's a pop culture reference. Now that I say this out loud, I'm doubting myself. Maybe it's not.
That's right. Well, and there's like, this isn't a dinosaur, but Bulbasaurus
Yeah.
is an early synapsid, and there's an Aerodactylus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which are things that, presumably, well, it depends if Pokemon ever dies.
Right?
But, someday in the distant future, I did go to like a little bit of my previous writings about weird fossil names to see if I could find an odd dinosaur name. And the best example that I found was a Pleistocene bird, which technically fits, which was an American species of lorikeet that went extinct not terribly long ago on an island. It might have been a Caribbean island that belonged to the genus Vini, Vini. And paleontologist Dave Stedman gave it the species name Vidi Vici and called it the conquered lorikeet because humans had driven it extinct.
Yep.
Aww.
So
That's sad.
it's funny. You laugh and you cry.
It's clever.
And that was another one I thought of, is like plays on words of how many of those are going to last the test of time. Like,
Oh, sure.
yeah, that pun doesn't make any sense anymore in the year, 56, whatever.
Vini Vidi Vici isn't even English.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't make sense in the context of the culture of the person who named it,
Mm-hmm.
except that it's a historically famous thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Also not a dinosaur, but Paramouse and Thisbe Mouse. That was a good one.
Yeah.
Lily, thank you for that question and for your support. Astrid, thank you for helping us to answer it. That was delightful. Listeners, thank you for listening. As always, there will be a blog post after this that we will put up on our website where you can go for links to more information about the subject of this episode. Big thanks to all the people who requested this episode topic. A thanks to all of our new patrons and old patrons. An extra special thanks to our top tier patrons, Danielle the Bug Lover, Sarah May, Melissa Barksdale, and Robert Mart. We release episodes every fortnight. Stay tuned for our regular fortnightly schedule. And finally, one last time, an enormous thanks to Astrid. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you. I would love to do this again sometime.
Absolutely.
Listeners, you heard it here. Send in requests, and if there are requests that are fitting for an Astrid return to the podcast, then maybe it'll happen. I can think of at least one very obvious choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is an unspoken sequel.
Yes.
Yes, there sure is.
Maybe one day we'll speak it.
Yes. Well, listen, listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, you let us know. That's how we know to do sequels. That's how sequels get greenlit.
Yes.
Is that you get a great response to the first one.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me on. This was great fun.
This was a delight. This was so much fun.
Absolutely. Everybody, happy Darwin Day. go reflect upon the history of this science that has brought us to where we are today.
Go do the cute things. Go show a museum person an animal.
Yeah, that's way nicer than what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Go bring a frog to a museum scientist.
Yeah, they would love that.
They would. It'd be great.
Absolutely. I was going to say, go spit on the grave of a 1800s problematic scientist. Do the thing Will suggested. That's a much nicer thing to do. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.